Celebrations surrounding Darwin's 200th anniversary was splashed across the news for months prior to the actual date. February 12, 2009 marked the 200th anniversary of the origin of species, altered how people view the meaning of human history and how scientific knowledge forms that view. On October 31, 2008, Pope Benedict XVI spoke at a multi-day conference organized by the Pontifical Academy of Sciences on creation and evolution, remarking,
"My predecessors, Pope Pius XII and Pope John Paul II, noted that there is no opposition between faith's understanding of creation and the evidence of the empirical sciences. In order to develop and evolve, the world must first be, and thus have come from nothing into being. It must be created, in other words, by the first being, who is such by essence."
Pope Benedict XVI views on creation are known today as theistic evolution. A theistic evolutionist is a person who accepts that evolution is the scientific description of how organisms change over time, that all organisms arrive through descent with modification. At the same time, he is a theist. He believes in a God who is both personal and concerned with his creation. Therefore, when one claims to be a theistic evolutionist, he is claiming to believe in both God and evolution at the same time. This pagan syncretism of evolution is refuted by Wayne Grudem, a professor of Bible and theology.
"God created the great creatures of the sea and every living and moving thing with which the water teems, according to their kinds, and every winged bird according to its kind. God made the wild animals according to their kinds, and all the creatures that move along the ground according to their kinds. And God saw that it was good." These statements seem inconsistent with the idea of God created or directing or observing millions of random mutations, none of which really were the kinds of plants or animals he wanted to have on the earth. Instead of the straightforward biblical account of God's creation, the theistic evolution view has to understand events to have occurred something like this. "And God said, 'Let the earth bring forth living creatures according to their kinds.' And after 387,492,871 attempts, God finally made a mouse that worked."
The danger of trying to harmonize evolution to the Christian faith is outlined by Roy Anderson.
The evolutionary philosophy, studied from any angle, must be recognized as an attack on the veracity of God's Word. Its one great aim seems to be to destroy faith in the Creator. If man has been growing gradually better and never had a fall through sin, then he does not need a Savior. Evolution and true Christianity can never be harmonized. They begin at two different points, they travel in two different directions, and they end at terminals as wide apart in two different directions, and they end at terminals as wide apart as the poles.
Professor and philosopher Mortimer Adler rebuked Christian syncretism for its naivety, for attaching pagan beliefs to creationism.
"Both cannot be true. You cannot have it both ways. You cannot keep your religious, your political, your moral beliefs, and also with another part of your mind hold Darwin's view of man's origin and nature to be true."
If humans are the result of a progress within natural evolutionary development, then there is no place for their fall, for death through sin, no need of God's law, of divine revelation in Scripture, of salvation through Christ, of the new creation work of the Holy Spirit, or of Christ's present intercession, second coming, or final judgment. Why would God use death to create humans in His image, which is love? If He used death to create, then why did He warn Adam of the evil of death and expose the depths of that evil through dying to save humans from the penalty of death? If death is the last enemy to be destroyed at the end of the controversy, then how could God use it to create before and after the beginning of the controversy? It seems that theistic evolutionists do not take into account the radical difference between these two worldviews. Charles Darwin's theory of evolution was never meant to harmonize with the Bible, but to replace it. Dawkins credits his atheism and hatred towards God to Darwin.
Darwin made it possible to be an intellectually fulfilled atheist.
Stephen Jay Gould, a famous evolutionary biologist reviewing Philip Johnson's book, Darwin on Trial, warns his colleagues not to fall into the trap in believing that science can disprove God's existence.
To say it for all my colleagues and for the umpteenth millionth time, science simply cannot, by its legitimate methods, adjudicate the issue of God's possible superintendence of nature. We neither affirm it nor deny it. We simply can't comment on it as scientists.
The tools of science can only measure material things and cannot extend their usefulness to the spiritual realm. Francis Collins, one of the world's leading scientists who works at the cutting edge of DNA, concluded that
in this modern era of cosmology, evolution, and the human genome, is there still the possibility of a richly satisfying harmony between the scientific and spiritual worldviews? I answer with a resounding yes. In my view, there is no conflict in being a rigorous scientist and a person who believes in God, who takes a personal interest in each one of us. Science's domain is to explore nature. God's domain is in the spiritual world, a realm not possible to explore with the tools and language of science. It must be examined with the heart, the mind, and the soul, and the mind must find a way to embrace both realms.
there are many reasons why a person might choose to be an atheist, but none of the reasons can be supported by science, since science cannot disprove the existence of God. Atheistic philosophers and scientists can only act as if science is on their side to make their belief in atheism seems rational. All the books written by today's celebrity atheists offer only an emotional response riddled with logical fallacies to explain why they are not Christians. Isaac Asimov, a popular science fiction author who also was a professor of biochemistry at Boston University, gave his unjustified reasons for rejecting the existence of God.
I am an atheist, out and out. It took me a long time to say it. I've been an atheist for years and years, but somehow I felt it was intellectually unrespectable to say one was an atheist, because it assumed knowledge that one didn't have. Somehow it was better to say one was a humanist or an agnostic. I finally decided that I'm a creature of emotion as well as reason. Emotionally, I am an atheist. I don't have the evidence to prove that God doesn't exist, but I so strongly suspect he doesn't, I don't want to waste my time.
We have discovered, as a result of careful inquiry, that there is a peculiar yet interesting resemblance between the ideas of origin of the ancients and those of Western thinkers. Many of the notions which are characteristics of the evolutionary thought of the 19th century up until today are also found in the cosmological speculations of the ancients. King Solomon said that there is a reputation of a global pursuit that is common in all ages, whether it be philosophy, spirituality, or vanity. He said that this is because most people are unwilling to accept divine revelation and are inattentive to history, giving them a false sense of originality, not knowing the plans of Satan to enslave them.
The thing that hath been, it is that which shall be, and the thing which is done is that which shall be done, and there is no new thing under the sun.
Biological arguments for racism may have been common before 1850, but they increased by orders of magnitude following the acceptance of evolution theory.
Darwin's book on the origins of species by means of natural selection, or the preservation of favored races in the struggle for life, changed the intellectual landscape of how people view race. In the 1800s, Darwin produced a scientific justification for viewing races in hierarchies. Darwin's bad ideas were developed in his Descent of Man, in which he ranked races in terms of what he believed were their nearness and likeness to gorillas. Then he went on to propose a ruthless prophecy of the extermination of the races he scientifically defined as inferior. If this were not done, he claimed, those races, with much higher birth rates than superior races, would exhaust the resources needed for the survival of better people, eventually dragging down all of civilization.
At some future period, not very distant as measured by centuries, the civilized races of man will almost certainly exterminate and replace throughout the world the savage races. At the same time, the anthropomorphous, the most human-looking apes, will no doubt be exterminated. The break will then be rendered wider, for it will intervene between man and a more civilized state, as we may hope, than the Caucasian, and some ape as low as a baboon, instead of, as at present, between the Negro or Australian and the gorilla.
This led to the great debate on who was and who wasn't human, and among the humans, who was the most human. A result of the debate was the case of Otto Benga, a pygmy who was found in the Congo in 1904 by explorer Samuel Werner, and introduced to the president of the Bronx Zoo, William Hornady. Chained and caged like an animal, he was taken to America, where evolutionist scientists displayed him to the public in the St. Louis World Fair, along with other ape species, and introduced him as the closest transitional link to man. He was freed only after some African American Baptist clergymen protested against the exhibit for promoting racism and Darwinism. Benga, being mentally scarred of the tragic experience, committed suicide. The Australian Aborigines were considered the missing link between the ape-like ancestor and the rest of mankind. This resulted in terrible prejudices and injustices towards the Aborigines. Ken Ham, the president of Ant Genesis, a native of Australia, co-authored a book about Darwin's influence on racism. Part of the book deals with the disgusting experiences the Aborigines endured in the name of Darwinian science.
In 1924, the New York Tribune ran a headline that declared kindred of Stone Age men discovered on Australian island, missing links with mankind in early dawn of history. When it appeared that the Aborigines might have some scientific value, biologists from England and Germany began to hunt them as research specimens. Many were driven into swamps and then shot. Hunters were given instructions on how to skin them and prepare their skulls as specimens for museums around the world, all in the name of evolution. Some were taken live, some were killed, and many of their graves were robbed. An estimated 5,000 to 10,000 graves were desecrated as scientists sought Aborigine remains for study.
Thomas Huxley also quoted Darwin's dangerous ideas on race. He said,
"No rational man cognizant of the facts believes that the average Negro is the equal, still less the superior of the white man."
Darwin himself opposed discriminating against the weak and helpless, but the implications in his writings brought untold suffering to many.
With savages, the weak in body or mind are soon eliminated, and those that survive commonly exhibit a vigorous state of health. We civilized men, on the other hand, do our utmost to check the process of elimination. We build asylums for the imbecile, the maimed, and the sick. We institute poor laws, and our medical men exert their utmost skill to save the life of everyone to the last moment. There is reason to believe that vaccination has preserved thousands who from a weak constitution would formerly have succumbed to smallpox. Thus the weak members of civilized societies propagate their kind. No one who has attended to the breeding of domestic animals will doubt that this must be highly injurious to the race of man. It is surprising how soon a want of care, or care wrongly directed, leads to the denigration of a domestic race, but accepting the case of man himself, hardly anyone is so ignorant as to allow his worst animals to breed. The aid which we feel impelled to give to the helpless is mainly an incidental result of the instinct of sympathy, which was originally acquired as part of the social instincts, but subsequently rendered, in the manner previously indicated, more tender and more widely diffused. Nor could we check our sympathy, even at the urging of hard reason, without deterioration in the noblest part of our nature. The surgeon may harden himself while performing an operation, for he knows that he is acting for the good of his patient. But if we were intentionally to neglect the weak and helpless, it could only be for a contingent benefit, with an overwhelming present evil. Hence, we must bear without complaining the undoubtedly bad effects of the weak surviving and propagating their kind. But there appears to be at least one check in steady action, namely the weaker and inferior members of society not marrying so freely as the sound. And this check might be indefinitely increased, though this is more to be hoped for than expected by the weak in body or mind refraining from marriage.
The Bible teaches that we should love others as we love ourselves. The Word of God proclaims,
"Thou shalt love thy neighbor as thyself. I am the Lord."
The New Testament teaches absolute equality of all people. There is no such thing as an inferior race in the Bible.
For there is no difference between the Jew and the Greek, for the same Lord over all is rich unto all that call upon him. where there is neither Greek nor Jew, circumcision nor uncircumcision, barbarian, Scythian, bond nor free, but Christ is all and in all.
When Samuel was rejected from being king, God asked Samuel to anoint one of Jesse's sons to be the next ruler. Samuel's first choice was Eliab, the eldest son with the most impressive appearance. God's response to Samuel's choice is an important lesson teaching us not to judge according to appearance.
But the Lord said unto Samuel, Look not on his countenance, or on the height of his stature, because I have refused him. For the Lord seeth not as man seeth. For man looketh on the outward appearance, but the Lord looketh on the heart.
The Bible says that we are all made in the image of God, and that all nations are of one blood. The Bible teaches that all human beings are equal because of God.
Hath made of one blood all nations of men for to dwell on all the face of the earth.
The vision of the redeemed saints in heaven is one of all nations, kindreds, people, and tongues, but no mention is made of races.
After this I beheld, and lo, a great multitude, which no man could number, of all nations and kindreds, and people and tongues, stood before the throne, and before the Lamb, clothed with white robes, and palms in their hands.
On September 10, 1998, ABC News Science page recognized that the word race is a meaningless word.
More and more scientists find that the differences that set us apart are cultural, not racial. Some even say that the word race should be abandoned because it's meaningless. We accept the idea of a race because it is a convenient way of putting people into broad categories, frequently to suppress them. What facts show is that there are differences among us, but they stem from culture, not race.
When Christ said to go teach all nations, he used the Greek word ethnos, translated nations to identify us belonging.
As a cluster of human beings that are set apart from others because of their language, culture, geography, or religion.
Christians were instrumental in abolishing slavery. No man fought harder to abolish slavery than William Wilberforce, a member of Parliament. He introduced anti-slavery abolitionist measures year after year for 40 years until he retired in 1825 due to failing health. On July 26, 1833, as he lay dying, word was brought him that the bill to outlaw slavery everywhere in the British Empire had passed in Parliament. The dream for which he had struggled for decades was now within sight of fulfillment.
The abolition movement was increasingly embraced by Christians within the Church of England and other mainstream denominations. The most famous of the abolitionists, however, was William Wilberforce, a precocious and talented member of Parliament who looked into the issue of slavery in the 1780s and became horrified at what the evidence told him. In 1789, he presented his abolition bill to the House of Commons in what was said to have been the best speech ever made to Parliament. In the gallery, we are told, traders and merchants who had come to listen hung their heads in shame at Wilberforce's denunciation of their cruelty. But his opponents used the traditional parliamentary tactics of delay and amendation, and when the bill was finally passed in 1792, it allowed only for the gradual abolition of the slave trade. He continued to campaign, but he also spent time writing works of popular theology. Strangely, it was war with Napoleon that helped him finally to gain what he wanted. Napoleon was opposed to abolition, and so the British public, patriotic as ever, were suddenly all for it. There were still slaves in the colonies, however, and Wilberforce continued to campaign on their behalf. It was not until 1833 that Parliament eventually abolished the whole thing. Wilberforce, satisfied at last, died 3 days later.
Bishop Samuel Wilberforce, the son of William Wilberforce, criticized Darwin's theory on scientific grounds, arguing that it was not supported by facts, and he noted that the greatest names in science were opposed to the theory.
Bishop Wilberforce and Charles Darwin were of one heart about the evils of slavery, but not about evolution. Wilberforce attacked Darwin's theory with wit, reminding the public that the theory had descended with little modification from Erasmus Darwin. Moreover, he made sure that the public was forewarned of its moral implications, namely that it would undo all the work the abolitionists had done to prove that slavery was immoral, wrong, and unjustifiable. If Darwin's theory were true, then human slavery was no less natural than ant slavery, hardly a matter for moral disapproval.
Darwin's family was passionately abolitionist, and he continually mixed with people devoted to the cause. Obviously, not all Darwinists are racist, but a Darwinist has no logical basis to frame an argument against slavery. Wilberforce tried to warn Darwin that his theory was flawed, but he did not want to recant.
Finally, we must never forget the moral context of the bishop's objections, and in particular the issue of slavery. Huxley's witticisms deflect us from the fact that Wilberforce understood very clearly that Darwin's theory would undermine the moral argument against slavery. He believed that evolution, particularly as Darwin had defined it, would destroy the arguments of the abolitionists and reverse the forward campaign to eradicate slavery entirely. This was a moral and scientific argument. For Wilberforce, it was a fact that slavery was a moral evil. He therefore warned Darwin after The Origin came out that it was an unavoidable conclusion, according to his argument, that natural slavery among ants affirmed slavery is natural among men. Wilberforce threw Darwin's own words back at him, that the tendency of the light-colored races of mankind to engage in the Negro slave trade was really a remains of the extraordinary and odious instinct which had possessed them before they had been improved by natural selection.
Those who seek to absolve Darwin of any responsibility for the consequences of scientific racialism like to point out that he was himself no more a racist than any other English gentleman of his times, that he passionately opposed slavery, and that he sometimes spoke and wrote warmly and in complimentary terms about people of African descent. All this may be true, but it is besides the point. For what gave the scientific racists their impetus were not Darwin's personal feelings or opinions, but speculations on origins of social behavior and moral qualities in man. Eugenics is a word coined by Darwin's cousin Francis Galton in 1865. It can be defined as a stance favoring the betterment of mankind by rational breeding of offspring. That goal is to be achieved by encouraging stronger, superior specimens of humanity to multiply while discouraging their weaker, defective counterparts from doing so. Darwin considered himself to be superior. He also considered his wealthy cousin and wife Emma Wedgwood to be superior. They brought into the world 10 inbred children. Darwin presumed if two superior humans, who were closely related, mated, the chances for markedly superior offspring would be excellent. The fruits of Darwin's inbreeding project were not what he expected. Researcher Taylor revealed the outcome of this experiment.
Darwin's idea of inbreeding to produce superior stock can be seen as a complete disaster in the case of his own 10 children. Of the 10, one girl, Mary, died shortly after birth. Another girl, Anne, died at the age of 10 years. His eldest daughter, Henrietta, had a serious and prolonged breakdown at 15 in 1859. 3 of his 6 sons suffered such frequent illness that Darwin regarded them as semi-invalids, while his last son, Charles Jr., was born mentally retarded and died in 1858, 19 months after birth.
Darwin's daughter Henrietta carried on his eugenics legacy with her husband.
Darwin's daughter Henrietta was married to Robert Litchfield. The couple had no children, but threw themselves into advancing eugenics, which would become a family cause, replacing their earlier abolitionist passion. Leonard Darwin was named president of the First International Congress of Eugenics, which had been organized by Francis Galton's eugenics. While Charles was alive, his son George Darwin was already showing himself to be a good eugenicist, championing easy divorce and contraception to cut down on undesirable traits being passed on.
Darwin's son Leonard Darwin was eventually persuaded to lend his name to the birth control movement. Eugenics would later inspire Margaret Sanger in her founding of Planned Parenthood and led to laws to sterilize forcibly the mentally or physically handicapped, Native Americans, African American women, and criminals.
The emergency problem of segregation and sterilization must be faced immediately. Every feeble-minded girl or woman of the hereditary type, especially of the moron class, should be segregated during the reproductive period. We prefer the policy of immediate sterilization, of making sure that parenthood is absolutely prohibited to the feeble-minded. To apply a stern and rigid policy of sterilization and segregation to that grade of population whose progeny is already tainted, to apportion farmlands and homesteads for these segregated persons where they would be taught to work under competent instructors for the period of their entire lives.
Altogether, over 65,000 individuals were sterilized in 33 states under the state compulsory sterilization programs in the United States.
United States state sterilization laws applied only to inmates of public mental institutions whose residents were disproportionately from lower income and minority groups. In Virginia, the overwhelming majority of those sterilized were poor. Perhaps as many as half of them were black. In California, more than half the insane males sterilized were unskilled or semi-skilled laborers. The foreign-born were more likely to be admitted to state mental institutions and to be sterilized once there. While they accounted for about a fifth of the California population in 1930, they represented at least a third of the group compelled to undergo the sterilization procedure.
The Bible is our safeguard against the unforeseen evils that comes with the dark philosophies of evolution.
Then Jesus said unto them, Yet a little while is the light with you. Walk while ye have the light, lest darkness come upon you. For he that walketh in darkness knoweth not whither he goeth.
In many ways, much have changed since the famous Scopes monkey trial in 1925. Every intellectual and cultural battle is won or lost in the assumptions. He who defines wins. The controversy between evolution and biblical creation is about much more than fossils and ape men. It concerns the basic presuppositions by which our society will answer questions concerning life, law, and human relationships. Most importantly, it is the battle over lordship. Who is Lord, God or man? Sir Julian Huxley, speaking in 1959 at the Darwin Centennial Celebration, commemorating the publication by Charles Darwin of The Origin of Species, Huxley replaced God with evolution.
Future historians will perhaps take this centennial week as epitomizing an important critical period in the history of this earth of ours. The period when the process of evolution, in the person of inquiring man, began to be truly conscious of itself. This is one of the first public occasions on which it has been frankly faced that all aspects of reality are subject to evolution, from atoms and stars to fish and flowers, from fish and flowers to human societies and values. Indeed, that all reality is a single process of evolution. In the evolutionary pattern of thought, there is no longer either need or room for the supernatural. The earth was not created, it evolved. So did all the animals and plants that inhabit it, including our own human selves, mind and soul, as well as brain and body. So did religion. Finally, the evolutionary vision is enabling us to discern, however incompletely, the lineaments of the new religion that we can be sure will arise to serve the needs of the coming era.
C.S. Lewis wrote about the attitude between ancient and modern man towards God.
The ancient man approached God, or even the gods, as the accused person approaches his judge. For the modern man, the roles are reversed. He is the judge. God is in the dock. He is quite a kindly judge. God should have a reasonable defense for being the God who permits war, poverty, and disease. He is ready to listen to it. The trial may even end in God's acquittal. But the important thing is that man is on the bench and God is in the dock.
Darwin offered modern man the same question which Satan posed to Eve. Had God said, thereby declaring man the ultimate source of authority. There are only two standards by which man can govern, the law of God or the will of man. America's founding fathers understood that there is no middle ground. They declared their allegiance to the Creator and acknowledged that He had established a law order with transcendent moral principles.
We hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights.
The Bill of Rights did not create rights, it acknowledged them. For decades, American law students learned the Genesis foundation for law from Sir William Blackstone, whose commentaries on the laws of England was their primary text. The commentaries were not merely an approach to the study of law, they were the law. Blackstone affirmed the authority of Scripture as the only legitimate foundation for society, and he specifically refuted the idea that laws could evolve as societies change. He wrote,
Man, considered as a creature, must necessarily be subject to the laws of his creator, for he is entirely a dependent being. And consequently, as man depends absolutely upon his maker for everything, it is necessary that he should in all points conform to his maker's will. This law of nature, being coexistent with mankind and dictated by God himself, is of course superior in obligation to any other. It is binding all over the globe in all countries and at all times. No human laws are of any validity if contrary to this, and such of them as are valid derive all their force and all their authority mediately or immediately from this original. The doctrines thus delivered what we call the revealed or divine law, and they are to be found only in the Holy Scriptures. These precepts, when revealed, are found upon comparison to be really a part of the original of nature. Upon these two foundations, the law of nature and the law of revelation, depend all human laws. That is to say, no human laws should be suffered to contradict these.
By 1920, the law of Blackstone had become obsolete. After reading Darwin's Origin of Species, the dean of Harvard Law School, Christopher Langdell, started teaching that since man had evolved, his laws must also evolve over time.
Langdell introduced the dismal practice of case study and legal precedent in the law. This approach allowed the judges to become the lawgivers instead of relying on the time-honored dependence on absolute principles of law, as defined by nature and nature's God, and codified principally in William Blackstone's famous Commentaries on the Laws of England.
Langdell and his school of thought was called legal positivism, a venomous standard of interpreting law that neutralizes the American Constitution. Langdell disciples and the crippling effect of legal positivism was clearly defined by Dr. John Eidsmoe, who holds 5 degrees in law, theology, and political science. He said this school of thought was followed by
Dean Roscoe Pound, Supreme Court Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr., and others, has been the predominant philosophy taught in law schools during the 1900s. Legal positivism can be summarized by the following points. 1. There are no objective, God-given standards of law, or if there are, they are irrelevant to the modern legal system. 2. Since God is not the author of the author of law must be man. In other words, law is law simply because the highest human authority, the state, has said it is law, and is able to back it up by force. 3. Since man and society evolve, therefore law must evolve as well. 4. Judges, through their decisions, guide the evolution of law. Note again, judges make law. 5. To study law, get at the original sources of law. The decisions of judges, hence most law schools today, use the case law method of teaching law.
Woodrow Wilson was president of Princeton and of the American Political Science Association before becoming president of the United States, was the first chief executive to openly criticize the Constitution, once comparing it to political witchcraft. Speaking about the doctrine of the evolving Constitution, Wilson said,
Living political constitution must be Darwinian in structure and in practice. Society is a living organism and must obey the laws of life. All that progressives ask or desire is permission to interpret the Constitution according to the Darwinian principle.
America continues spiraling downhill after this point. The prophet Isaiah similarly saw the fall of Israel due to removing God's law as the standard to living.
The earth also is defiled unto the inhabitants thereof, because they have transgressed the laws, changed the ordinance, broken the everlasting covenant.
To some modern intellectuals, Christian faith and intellectual backwardness are so naturally linked that the relationship is not even argued. The connection is asserted as established fact. For Dawkins and people of his pedigree, intelligence is measured by one's commitment to atheism.
Highly intelligent people are mostly atheists, he says. Not a single member of either House of Congress admits to being an atheist. It just doesn't add up. Either they're stupid or they're lying. The higher one's intelligence or education level, the less one is likely to be religious or hold beliefs of any kind.
If this is true, why did the pioneers of the scientific revolution choose the Bible over atheism? Why didn't the ancient anti-religious Roman philosopher Lucretius perfected atomism? Many atheists like Christopher Hitchens admire Lucretius and Epicurus for their diatribes against religion. Why did it take until the 1600s for Pierre Gassendi, a Catholic priest, French philosopher and scientist, to revive atomism and cleanse it from its ungodly teachings and made it useful to science? What we have seen so far will easily refute the new atheist's arrogant claim that highly intelligent people are mostly atheists. Professor Anthony Flew was the world's most prominent atheist philosopher of the 20th century. For decades, he has been the dominant figure in the philosophy of religion, among the most influential of atheist philosophers. Flew announced his departure from the miserable ranks of atheism in 2004. Flew accepted the existence of God before his recent death, saying that he had to go where the evidence leads. The new atheists will do well to consider this riveting statement by their ex-leader.
I think that the Christian religion is the one religion that most clearly deserves to be honored and respected. There is nothing like the combination of a charismatic figure like Jesus and a first-class intellectual like St. Paul. Virtually all the argument about the content of the religion was produced by St. Paul, who had a brilliant philosophical mind and could both speak and write in all the relevant languages. If you're wanting omnipotence to set up a religion, this is the one to beat.
What was the new atheist response to Flew's argument? They were sarcastic, a trademark of fundamentalist atheists.
The over-publicized tergiversation of the philosopher Anthony Flew, who announced in his old age that he had been converted to belief in some sort of deity. Maybe Flew's alleged conversion will be rewarded with the Templeton Prize. A first step in that direction is his ignominious decision to accept in 2006 the Philip E. Johnson Award for Liberty and Truth. The first holder of the Philip E. Johnson Award was Philip E. Johnson, the lawyer credited with founding the intelligent design wedge strategy. Flew will be the second holder. The awarding university is Biola, the Bible Institute of Los Angeles. One can't help wondering whether Flew realizes that he is being used. It doesn't matter that Flew, once an atheist, later devolved into deism.
Contrary to what many non-believers think, the Bible does not teach blind faith. The Bible actually tells believers to test everything.
Prove all things. Hold fast that which is good.
The Bible encouraged people to use their minds. In fact, the Bible says that God created humans and endowed them with a mind so that they would use it.
The heart of the prudent getteth knowledge, and the ear of the wise seeketh knowledge.
God wants believers to be knowledgeable, especially regarding their faith. A lack of knowledge leads to apostasy and destruction, as God himself said to the prophet Hosea.
My people are destroyed for lack of knowledge, because thou hast rejected knowledge. I will also reject thee, that thou shalt be no priest to me. Seeing thou hast forgotten the law of thy God, I will also forget thy children.
A noteworthy example of what it means to be a mentally equipped follower of Yahweh are Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. They spent 3 years training in the University of Babylon for wise men, and they completed the training. The king of Babylon rigorously questioned them after the 3 years. He found them to be intellectually superior to the wise men of Babylon.
As for these 4 children, God gave them knowledge and skill in all learning and wisdom, and Daniel had understanding in all visions and dreams. Now, at the end of the days that the king had said he should bring them in, then the prince of the eunuchs brought them in before Nebuchadnezzar, and the king communed with them, and among them all was found none like Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. Therefore stood they before the king, and in all matters of wisdom and understanding that the king inquired of them, he found them 10 times better than all the magicians and astrologers that were in all his realm.
Today's Christianity is for the most part a dumbed-down version of what Christianity is supposed to be. Few Christians are equipped to deal with today's subculture, leaving the unchristian to believe that the church is a place of mindless spirituality, that is, lacking in intellectual achievement and cultural cultivation and critical thinking. The laxity of Christian thought in the marketplace of ideas is documented by the president of the Barna Group, which provides research and resources on Christianity.
Most Americans assume that smart people are rarely devout and that devout Christians rarely scale the academic heights. In truth, Christian anti-intellectualism was an anomaly of the 20th century. For the majority of the time, it has not been a part of the church's past.
Let us take a glimpse of the purpose of the educational system in America and see how far they have drifted from the landmark. The Old Deluded Act was passed in Massachusetts in the mid-17th century because the Puritans were deeply religious and believed in the very real presence of Satan. They believed if they read and study the scriptures enough, they could resist evil and Satan's temptations. This act was the first education act in America to make sure all townships with 50 or more households provided a school to teach children to read and write. Learning to read and write was a necessity in order to thwart the old deluder Satan. Education in early America was much different than that of today in form and results. Most education was done in home or church. This is where the ideas and character were implanted in America's founders. Such training produced one of the greatest group of men in thought and character of all time. Noah Webster, one of the greatest of American educators, wrote in his original dictionary published in 1828, his definition of education was:
Education, the bringing up as a child, instruction, formation of manners. Education comprehends all that series of instruction and discipline which is intended to enlighten the understanding, correct the temper, and form the manners and habits of youth, and fit them for usefulness in their future stations. To give children a good education in manners, arts, and science is important. To give them a religious education is indispensable, and an immense responsibility rests on parents and guardians who neglect these duties.
To Webster, the central goal of education was to train the youth in the precepts of Christianity. Webster would not recognize the dictionary that bears his name today. America is going downhill because they have left the standard of righteousness for humanistic principles.
Righteousness exalteth a nation, but sin is a reproach to any people.
The world have dramatically changed due to evolution, to the point of radically changing Webster's words on education. The 1959 Revised Unabridged edition gives a more secular trimming to the word education.
Education. 1. The process of training and developing the knowledge, skill, mind, character, etc., especially by formal schooling, teaching, training. 2. Knowledge, ability, etc., thus developed. 3. Formal schooling. B. A kind or stage of this as a medical education, a high school education. 4. Systematic study of the problems, methods, and theories of teaching and learning.
Also deliberately hidden from view, almost every prestigious university in America today had its origins within Christianity. Due to lack of vigilance, Christians have lost their universities to the secularists. Alvin Smith, in his insightful book, had written about the rise and loss of these Christian institutions.
Most colleges and universities that are well known today began as Christian schools. Harvard College, established in 1636, now known as Harvard University, was founded by the Congregational Church as a theological institution. The College of William and Mary started as an Episcopalian school, also primarily to train clergy. Yale University began mostly as a congregational institution to educate ministers in our own way. The Methodists founded Northwestern University in Evanston, Illinois. Columbia University began as an Episcopalian venture. Princeton University started as a Presbyterian school, and Brown University had Baptist origins. Even some state universities, for example, the University of Kentucky, the University of California at Berkeley, and the University of Tennessee, had their origins as church schools. But today, these institutions of higher learning have abandoned their one-time Christian foundations.
A number of modern scientists still accept the concept of a six-day creation by God as depicted in the Bible. John Ashton, editor of the book titled "In 6 Days, Why 50 Scientists Choose to Believe in Creation," presents essays by 50 scientists with doctoral level degrees, explaining why they believe the biblical account of creation. The theory of evolution has been discredited in scientific circles. Since this theory first appeared, a large number of scientific findings have invalidated its claims, one by one. As of July 2007, over 700 scientists, most of them with PhDs, have signed a
dissent list with Discovery Institute affirming their agreement with the statement that we are skeptical of claims for the ability of random mutation and natural selection to account for the complexity of life. Careful examination of the evidence for Darwinian theory should be encouraged.
Since the notion of organic evolution is devoid of any supporting evidence, honest scientists must conclude, as many already have, that the assumption is pure fantasy. The only other option is special creation, which is proven by identifiable species, both fossil and living. The recognition of this evidence demands that the lies of the evolutionists be completely rejected and that the truth of special creation be proclaimed. Another interesting facet of history is the connection between evolution and communism. Karl Marx was a member of an Illuminati front organization called the League of Just Men. Gary Allen explains.
Karl Marx was hired by a mysterious group who called themselves the League of Just Men to write the Communist Manifesto as a demagogic boob bait to appeal to the mob. In actual fact, the Communist Manifesto was in circulation for many years before Marx's name was widely enough recognized to establish his authorship for this revolutionary handbook. All Karl Marx really did was to update and codify the very same revolutionary plans and principles set down 70 years earlier by Adam Weishaupt, the founder of the Order of Illuminati in Bavaria. And it is widely acknowledged by serious scholars of this subject that the League of Just Men was simply an extension of the Illuminati, which was forced to go deep underground after it was exposed by a raid conducted by the Bavarian authorities.
The discussion of Darwin's book wasn't limited to scientists and clergymen. At 15 shillings, several days' pay for a skilled craftsman, the original species was too expensive to be found in many workers' homes. But groups of radical workers in several cities took up collections to buy one copy that could be passed around. One of Darwin's closest collaborators, Thomas Huxley, organized a series of very well-attended public lectures on evolution for working men in London. In those talks, which was subsequently published as a popular pamphlet, Huxley had no hesitation in defending a key point Darwin only hinted at in Origin, that humans too are a product of natural selection and share common ancestors. Karl Marx attended several of Huxley's lectures and encouraged his political associates to do likewise.
Perhaps the most notable was Karl Marx, at the time living in London and attending Huxley's public lectures on Darwinian evolution. Marx found the struggle to the death principle in natural selection a perfect confirmation of his own view of man's class struggle, and in appreciation sent Darwin a copy of his Das Kapital in 1873. It had been published in 1867. 6 years later, Marx wrote to Darwin requesting permission to dedicate his next volume to him. However, Darwin declined the offer, explaining that it would pain certain members of his family if he were associated with so atheistic a book.
With communism, the struggle of race is replaced by the struggle of class, as history is viewed as an evolutionary struggle. Marx saw the living world in terms of a Darwinian survival of the fittest struggle, involving the triumph of the strong and the subjugation of the weak. Marx saw in Darwin's writings a scientific support for his version of Hegelianism. It was Georg Hegel who held that the absolute spirit fulfills itself or realizes itself in the history of the world. And Hegel's deduction of categories, it is clear that man realizes himself through the attainment of unity with the absolute in philosophy, art, and religion.
In Hegel's philosophy, God did not exist over and above the world as in Christian orthodoxy, but was rather a world spirit found in the depths of all natural processes. All reality was simply a manifestation of this world spirit, referred to in some as the absolute spirit, while religion was an imaginative and pictorial way of representing the truth of this philosophy. Hegel visualized the absolute spirit to be directing an ongoing developmental or evolutionary process in nature, including humanity. While that process had taken an irregular course of continuing ascent, the upward path was seen to be one of a dialectical struggle between positive and negative entities, but the outcome was always to produce a balanced, harmonious synthesis, something better.
Hegel formulates what is called the Hegelian dialectic, the process by which Illuminati objectives are achieved. According to the Hegelian dialectic, thesis plus antithesis equals synthesis. In other words, first you foment a crisis, then there is an enormous public outcry that something must be done about the problem. So you offer a solution that brings about the changes you really wanted all along, but which people would have been unwilling to accept initially. Chicago Mayor Rahm Emanuel, a former congressman who also worked for 2 presidents, said, Rule 1. Never allow a crisis to go to waste. Mr. Emanuel said in an interview on Sunday, there are opportunities to do big things. The followers of Lucifer are daily preparing our world to accept his one-world religion of lawlessness. The inhabitants of this world are being deceived and manipulated through his strategy of Hegelian principle. Many researchers claim that Hegel was an idealistic pantheist.
Hegel's absolute bears little resemblance to the Spinozistic type of all-inclusive divine unity, but it is a unity, no matter how differentiated, and it is divine. Unless it could be shown why Hegel's absolute could not be taken to be a unity in some relevantly pantheistic sense, or why his attribution of divinity to the absolute is inappropriate to pantheism, then Hegel is a pantheist. His absolute is at least a prima facie instance of an all-inclusive divine unity, and his denial that he is a pantheist is dependent upon his very particular understanding of what pantheism is. In denying that he was a pantheist, he may in part have simply been trying to avoid some of the negative, that is to say, non-theistic connotations.
Hegel had a powerful impact on the development of pantheism. Marx tries to explain everything in material conditions, to make it scientific instead of spiritual, but he never really escaped the metaphysical aspect of Hegelianism. This was highlighted in the myth of religious neutrality by a professor of philosophy and religion at the College of New Jersey.
It should be clear, however, that although Marx was indeed an atheist, his theories all presuppose the self-existence of matter. Physical matter, along with its innate law of dialectical development, is just there. Matter depends on nothing whatsoever, and all of reality is either identical with or depends on matter. For this reason, despite its protests to the contrary, Marx's theory is based on a religious belief. And what is more to the point, this religious belief is a typically pagan one, since it takes something about the creation to be the self-existent segment of reality on which all else depends.
The materialists who proudly proclaim that they do not believe in God, but believe that everything is governed by nature and determined by laws of nature or laws of history, differs from the pantheist by the name he gives to God, but not necessarily anything else. Russell made a revealing comparison between Marx communism and Yahwism.
Yahweh equals dialectical materialism. The Messiah equals Marx. The elect equals the proletariat. The second coming equals the revolution. The millennium equals the end of history and communism.
Future communists recognized the importance of Marx and Darwin as patron saints of their movement and vigorously defended them. Cliff Connor, an unrepentant Marxist, said,
The socialist movement recognized Darwinism as an important element in its general world outlook right from the start. When Darwin published his Origin of the Species in 1859, Karl Marx wrote a letter to Friedrich Engels in which he said, "This is the book which contains the basis in natural history for our view, and of all those eminent researchers of the 19th century who have left us such a rich heritage of knowledge, we are especially grateful to Charles Darwin for opening our way to an evolutionary dialectical understanding of nature."
The greatest mass murderers in history have been committed not by Christians but by communists, including Lenin, Stalin, and Mao, to name just a few. In late 1997, Robert Laffont published the Black Book on Communism, an 858-page book of scholarly essays that collectively provide a history of communism in the 20th century. The author's estimated death toll due to communism is staggering.
This factual approach puts communism in what is, after all, its basic human perspective. For it was, in truth, a tragedy of planetary dimensions in the French publisher's characterization, with a grand total of victims variously estimated by contributors to the volume at between 85 million and 100 million.
Without the usual euphemism, anthropologist Arthur Keith delineates:
if war be the progeny of evolution, and I am convinced that it is, then evolution has gone mad, reaching such a height of ferocity as must frustrate its proper role in the world of life, which is the advancement of her competing units, these being tribes, nations, or races of mankind. There is no way of getting rid of war save one, and that is to rid human nature of the sanctions imposed on it by the law of evolution. Can man render the law of evolution null and void? I have discovered no way that it is at once possible and practicable.
Evolution reveals the dark, bloody nature of Lucifer's malicious agenda and his continued rebellion and desire for supremacy over Yahweh and his creation.
Woe to the inhabitants of the earth and of the sea, for the devil is come down unto you, having great wrath, because he knoweth that he hath but a short time.
Now is an opportune time to bring to light the feistiness of secularism. The main tenets of secularism is to produce a society devoid of religious influence. The word secular means of this world in Latin, and it is the opposite of religious. Writing about the sacred in the Encyclopedia of Religion, Professor Winston King elaborated:
Even Western thinkers who recognize their cultural bias find it hard to escape because the assumptions of theism permeate the linguistic structures that shape their thought. Sacredness is the quality of being set apart from the usual or ordinary. Its antonym, profane, literally means outside the fane. The sacred is what is specifically set apart for holy or religious use. The secular is what is left over, the world outside, the current age and its fashions and concerns. This thoroughgoing separation has been institutionalized in a multitude of forms.
The foundation for the secular-sacred dichotomy has a theological foundation. Christ made a clear distinction between the holy and the secular, or worldly, when he said,
"My kingdom is not of this world."
Jesus announced a kingdom of heaven, which implied the existence of other kingdoms, secular ones. The Old and New Testament secularization of nature is lethal to all forms of Satan's pantheistic religions.
There can be a superstitious dread, an idolization of unworthy things. The sacred marks out passages between this world and another, where grace reaches through to humankind. Superstition can clog this area, and it seems to have no natural enemies. It can multiply and grow like a cancer that threatens a more truly spiritual and ethical understanding of religion. It is precisely this fear of superstition that encourages us to recognize an area of the secular as part of God's creation and plan. Even for believers, some of God's creation has no association with saving grace, but is there for our ordinary use. To think that all of creation is sacred would come close to pantheism, where everything is God. When everything is sacred, nothing is really sacred, which is a strain of full-time mystics. The secular area varies with cultures. There's no list of intrinsically secular things. Part of this process of intellectual differentiation is to conceive of gods and separate them from other manifestations of the divine. This enables societies to break out of a purely anonistic view of things by concentrating the divine and contrasting it with the ordinary.
The Christian pioneers of science obeyed the sacred-secular distinction to their benefit. The secular humanists arrogantly came along and hijacked the concept of the secular from the sacred.
So ironically, separating religious doctrines and religious officials and institutions from other aspects of life is the first instance of secularization. Identifying the religious creates a secular world by default.
Replacing God with man's deification of reason is what motivated the French Enlightenment. Secularism sprouted from this intellectual environment, continuing the war against God. Idolatry is the result of separating the sacred from the secular.
Western society, in turning away from Christian faith, has turned to other things. This process is commonly called secularization, but that conveys only the negative aspect. The word connotes the turning away from the worship of God while ignoring the fact that something is being turned to in its place. All such principles that substitute for God exemplify the biblical concept of idol.
The Enlightenment combined Christian concepts such as justice and individual rights with secular ideas. The late 18th century was called the Age of Reason, but it certainly wasn't secular reasoning in the pure sense. It was rational thought within a largely Christian worldview. Syncretism is a blending of two or more philosophies or religions. Most secular people borrow moral teachings from religion. In the West, that usually means Christianity. Secularism as a worldview has no moral code. Secularism by definition has no deity, hence no lawgiver and no laws. Secularism in essence is a non-legislating philosophy. People who embrace secularism soon become unmoored. In order to obtain some form of meaning in life, secularists tend to quickly adopt a limited amount of moral teachings from Christianity. The origins of the secularist humanist delusion has its nexus with Eve's encounter with the serpent. Historian Herbert Schlossberg made a compelling case for the origins of the bewitching experience of Eve and her humanist descendants.
Law also brands as idolatrous the proclivity of humanist sentiment to act as the autonomous giver of statutory law. Humanist law can function as an autonomous standard only when faith in God's law is absent. That was what the serpent told Eve. You will be like God, knowing good and evil. There can be no plainer description of the humanist delusion or clear explanation of the idolatrous nature of humanist antinomianism, theological or avowedly secular. The biblical view is that God informs humanity about what is good and what is evil, and the form this information takes is law, which means that there are normative and judgmental aspects to it. The alternate view is in the temptation succumbed to by Eve and her humanist descendants to make autonomous judgments about good and evil and so be like God. That is why no statement that describes humanist teaching as secular can be allowed to pass unchallenged.
In rejecting Yahweh, they became allies of Satan, who is the god of this world.
In whom the God of this world hath blinded the minds of them which believe not, lest the light of the glorious gospel of Christ, who is the image of God, should shine unto them.
As a pseudo-god, Satan tempted Christ to bow down and acknowledge him as the god of this secular world. Christ immediately rejected this offer, and so should we.
Again, the devil taketh him up into an exceeding high mountain, and sheweth him all the kingdoms of the world and the glory of them, and saith unto him,
All these things will I give thee, if thou wilt fall down and worship me.
Then saith Jesus unto him, Get thee hence, Satan, for it is written, Thou shalt worship the Lord thy God, and him only shalt thou serve.
The secularization of Western Christian culture, which privatized religion, and the prevailing scientific theories of classical physics, exacerbated the perception that science and religion were diametrically opposed.
To be an atheist, you don't need any positive philosophy at all or need to be a good person. Morality is merely an adaptation put in place to further our reproductive ends. In an important sense, ethics as we understand it is an illusion fobbed off on us by our genes to get us to cooperate. The sense of spiritual relief which comes from rejecting the idea of God as a superhuman being is enormous.
Where did morality come from, and what purpose does it serve? How could there be objective moral values in a universe containing only matter in motion, evolving by chance. Such values could exist only in a universe created by a moral being, that is, by God. Humans are created in the image of God, while animals relate to one another within their own subhuman category. Within creation anthropology, mankind is viewed as the special creation of God, endowed by God with dignity, honor, authority, and responsibility. Human beings are unique from all other creatures. Within their very natures, they have a God-given moral capacity called conscience to discern right from wrong. Even in our fallen state, God holds us responsible for avoiding evil. In Romans chapter 2, the Apostle Paul is speaking about those peoples of the world who have never had the privilege of being given God's moral law as the ancient Israelites were. He says,
For when the Gentiles, which have not the law, do by nature the things contained in the law, these, having not the law, are a law unto themselves, which shew the work of the law written in their hearts, their conscience also bearing witness, and their thoughts the meanwhile accusing or else excusing one another.
Here Paul describes the idea of natural law or general revelation. It is not within our fallen nature to be inherently good, without sin. But it is in our nature, both before and after the fall, to be able to differentiate between good and evil. Leon Morris was right when he wrote about the ontological relationship between humans and natural law.
He knows enough of law to be guilty when he sins, even though he may not know the God who prescribes right conduct, or even that there is a God who prescribes it.
Only a moral God could be the source of a moral detector like conscience. The righteousness of the source is reflected in how quickly conscience responds to good and bad, and how keenly it feels the difference.
Now we know that what things soever the law saith, it saith to them who are under the law, that every mouth may be stopped, and all the world may become guilty before God.
The Apostle Paul, before he had a revelation of Jesus, his state of mind was,
O wretched man that I am, who shall deliver me from the body of this death? I thank God through Jesus Christ our Lord. So then with the mind I myself serve the law of God, but with the flesh the law of sin.
The aim of salvation is to save us from sin, which is transgression of the law.
Whosoever committeth sin transgresseth also the law, for sin is the transgression of the law. And she shall bring forth a son, and thou shalt call his name Jesus, for he shall save his people from their sins.
Professor Bazazowski, a nationally known ethical and political philosopher, has written about the purpose and shortcomings of natural law.
True, the law written on the heart is utterly inferior to the revealed truth of the gospel. For though it tells us what sin is, it tells us nothing of how to escape it. Yet it too is a real gift of God, for we have to know the bad news before we can grasp the good news.
Thomas Oden established a well-crafted argument that conscience proves the existence of God because, although it is within us, it is not manufactured by us. It is an imposing law prompting us to seeking union with a transcendent lawgiver.
The wicked man runs away with no one in pursuit. The proverb knew, but from whom is one running away? What is one afraid of? To say merely oneself may not fully account for the fact that this voice within oneself, conscience, points to that which is beyond oneself. Yet conscience is not something we merely give, and therefore could fail to give, ourselves, but is latently God bestowed within every self, and is constitutive of the self. It desires and longs for communion and reconciliation with the one who gives moral order.
C.S. Lewis came to a similar conclusion when he said,
Consequently, this rule of right and wrong, or law of human nature, or whatever you call it, must somehow or other be a real thing, a thing that is really there, not made up by ourselves. It begins to look as if we shall have to admit that there is more than one kind of reality, that in this particular case, there is something above and beyond the ordinary facts of men's behavior, and yet quite definitely real, a real law which none of us made, but which we find pressing on us.
Anyone who denies that he himself perceives moral value as objective may in fact be hampered by a defective conscience, or by a conscience so habitually suppressed that it no longer functions normally. But only sociopaths whom we acknowledge as abnormal are capable of living without moral conscience. Every normal person has a sense of moral responsibility, which by definition is that he is responding to someone outside of himself, someone who has written a standard of righteousness within the hearts of everyone. Relativists try to nullify objective moral values by appealing to a plurality of morals in different civilizations that differ from one another. As a former atheist turned Christian, Lewis contemplated this argument and refuted it in his book Mere Christianity.
There have been differences between their moralities, but these have never amounted to anything like a total difference. If anyone will take the trouble to compare the moral teaching of, say, the ancient Egyptians, Babylonians, Hindus, Chinese, Greeks, and Romans, what will really strike him will be how very like they are to each other and to our own. Men have differed as regards to what people you ought to be unselfish to, whether it was only your own family or your fellow countrymen or everyone. But they have always agreed that you ought not to put yourself first. Selfishness has never been admired. Men have differed as to whether you should have one wife or four, but they have always agreed that you must not simply have any woman you liked.
Odin's next argument for God's existence is regarding conscience as a reflection of his omnipotence and omnibenevolence.
Just as relative moral necessity cannot be required of the will except by that which is relatively good, so absolute moral necessity cannot be caused by any good less than the insurmountable good. A sense of absolute obligation can only come from one to whom absolute moral authority is fittingly and legitimately ascribed. It is to this transcended ground of obligation that conscience witnesses, for conscience does not pretend to make the laws that it dictates.
Without God, there is no absolute right or wrong that imposes itself on our conscience. Without God, there are no objective moral values, only a subjective relativism that has no restraining order. Although Dawkins has no regard for God, he acknowledges that
we have a moral sense which is built into our brains.
In his book, which is laced with diatribes against the God of the Ten Commandments, Dan Barker, a prominent American atheist who served as a Christian preacher for 19 years, said,
"If there were a God, then its moral decrees would originate from its mind."
God does exist, and we have objective moral values that cannot be created or changed by our insubordination to our Creator. Morality cannot be invented by men, says Bernard Gert, the Stone Professor of Intellectual and Moral Philosophy at Dartmouth College.
A general moral rule is unchanging and unchangeable, discovered rather than invented. It is not dependent on the will or decision of any person or group of persons. These characteristics are obviously closely connected, for to say that these rules are unchangeable is to say they cannot be subject to the will or decision of any person or group of persons. Since general moral rules apply to all rational persons at all times, obviously they cannot be invented or changed or subject to the will of anyone.
Secular humanists, evolutionists, and atheists brag that science is the only way to be sure of anything because its truths are objective and not subjective to our opinions. They say this is the reasons why science is more trustworthy than religion. However, when it comes to morality, they construe it to be subjective to our interpretation of what is moral. Science revealed that the world is governed by fixed laws, but the morality of its inhabitants does not have an objective moral law as a guide. However, virtue is subjective to whatever we deem it to be. D'Souza contemplated this double standard and said,
"We are accustomed to speaking of the scientific laws of nature. It is worth asking if there are moral laws of human nature. Many of us are the unwitting heirs to a philosophy that denies objective morality. We hold that science is objective, but values are subjective. We believe we can know scientific things, but morality is a matter of mere opinion. On this basis, we say things like, 'Don't impose your beliefs on me,' while it would never occur to us to say, 'Don't impose your algebra on me.' Yet have we considered the possibility that there are moral laws in nature that are no less reliable and comprehensible than scientific laws?
Evolutionary anthropology depicts man as having evolved from previous forms of life to contemporary forms. During this process, humans develop various behaviors which give them an advantage, enabling them to survive within their particular environment and culture. These behaviors depend on the particular circumstances. What is advantageous in one place may be detrimental in another. This system of ethics has no regard for the truth. Researcher Paul Copan writes,
If we are blindly hardwired by nature to accept certain beliefs because of their survival-enhancing value, then we would not have access to the truth status of these beliefs. They may aid our survival, but how could we know whether they are true or false?
How do you define morality without a standard by which to measure it? A standard has to remain standard. If this standard would derive only from people and not an unchanging God, then it wouldn't be a standard. If morality was a man-made creation, then morals would clash with others. Avowed atheist Sam Harris tells us, for example, that
The problem is that once we abandon our belief in a rule-making God, the question of why a given action is good or bad becomes a matter of debate.
The atheist philosopher Michael Roos said,
The position of the modern evolutionist is that humans have an awareness of morality as a biological adaptation no less than our hands and feet and teeth. Considered as a rationally justifiable set of claims about an objective something, ethics is illusory. I appreciate that when somebody says, love thy neighbor as thyself, they think they are referring above and beyond themselves. Nevertheless, such reference is truly without foundation. Morality is just an aid to survival and reproduction, and any deeper meaning is illusory.
Without God, morality becomes just a matter of personal taste, similar to the statement like, carrot tastes good. While they taste good to some people, others may prefer different vegetables. It is not a matter of objective truth, but a subjective matter of taste. A statement like, cannibalizing children is wrong, becomes simply an expression of personal preference, such as, I don't like eating children. Jeffrey Dahmer, one of America's most infamous serial killers who cannibalized more than 17 young men before being captured, gave his last interview with Dateline NBC 9 months before his death, and said the following to explain his actions.
If you don't think that there is a God to be accountable to, then what's the point of trying to modify your behavior to keep it within acceptable ranges? That's how I thought anyway. I always believed the theory of evolution is truth, that we all just came from the slime. When we died, that was it. There was nothing. I've since come to believe that the Lord Jesus Christ is truly God, and I believe that I, as well as everyone else, will be accountable to Him.
Dahmer credits the Bible for renewing his sanity. All crime is a result of sin. Of course, there was crime before Charles Darwin promoted his theory of evolution, but as the popularity of his theory grew, so did the crime rate. Faithful Darwinians would not criticize cannibalism as something consistently evil, because it depends on the evolutionary circumstances that make it right or wrong.
Following the logic of Darwinism, cannibalism isn't evil, even for human beings. It's just bad strategy. Of course, it would be an evolutionary stable strategy for a particular group of human beings if they simply are human beings from other tribes or races, and we do find quite stable societies that have adopted cannibalism. If human beings are simply one more kind of animal generated by evolution, then such cannibalism cannot be condemned.
I am not saying everyone who believes in evolution will become a Jeffrey Dahmer. I am saying naturalism taken to the extreme has consequences that are often overlooked. Most atheists are decent people compared to Dahmer, but their decency did not derive from following the logical end of their belief in evolution. A sense of decency comes from the God-given conscience that dictates a sense of right and wrong. Ravi Zacharias noted,
Not all atheists are immoral, but morality as goodness cannot be justified with atheistic presuppositions. An atheist may be morally minded, but he just happens to be living better than his belief about what the nature of man warrants. He may have personal moral values, but he cannot have any sense of compelling and universal moral obligation. Moral duty cannot logically operate without a moral law, and there is no moral law in an amoral world.
That divine conviction of what you ought to do is why the world is not completely disoriented. When Peter and the other apostles were brought before the tribunal for obeying God's words and were forbidden to preach in Jesus' name, Peter said,
We ought to obey God rather than men.
Immanuel Kant concluded that two things fill the human heart with awe.
The starry heavens above and the moral law within, I see them before me and connect them directly with the consciousness of my existence.
What follows is an example of how secular humanists exalt certain virtues that we ought to obey without God. Paul Kurtz put forth a system of ethics that we as humans should follow.
We ought to tell the truth, keep promises, be honest, sincere, beneficent, reliable, and dependable. Show fidelity, appreciation, and gratitude. Be fair-minded, just, and tolerant. We ought to negotiate our differences reasonably and try to be cooperative. We ought not to steal or to injure, maim, or harm other persons.
It would be wonderful if everyone would abide by these rules, but they did not originate from naturalism. Ironically, while rejecting the God of the Bible, the Humanist Manifesto traces these virtues not to Darwinism, but to the Bible.
Humanists hold that each individual should be treated humanely. Similarly, they accept the golden rule that we should not treat others as we would not like to be treated. They accept the biblical injunction that we should accept the aliens within our midst, respecting their differences with us. We do not deny that religionists have done much good. What we deny is that religious piety is the sole guarantee of moral virtue.
Harris unknowingly borrows biblical principles when he condemns rape as a cancer and a danger to our society. But his argument against rape, as we noticed before, is a matter of opinion because we are higher social animals without a moral law that is an unchangeable standard for humanity.
Nature has selected for many things that we would have done well to leave behind us in the jungles of Africa. The practice of rape may have once conferred an adaptive advantage on our species, and rapists of all shapes and sizes can indeed be found in the natural world. Dolphins, orangutans, chimpanzees, etc. Admittedly, the problem of adjudicating what counts as happiness and which forms of happiness should supersede others is difficult.
No beings either singly or collectively have the power to impose laws upon every single member of mankind and make every member of mankind legal and rightful subjects, with the unquestionable responsibility to perfectly obey them. Whenever and wherever man has made laws, the law's authority has always been limited. Without reference to God, it's impossible to anchor morality in society. Harris cannot demonstrate a good evolutionary reason for a rapist to resist his carnal desires, because the prime motivating force behind evolution is preservation of the gene pool. And if a person not fortunate enough to acquire a mate decides to force himself upon an unwilling partner in the game of survival of the fittest, why should it be wrong? Anthropologists Craig Palmer and Randy Thornhill have written about this in their controversial book, A Natural History of Rape, Biological Basis of Sexual Coercion. In an interview with Craig Palmer, John Lofton asked him to summarize his book. Palmer said he had written the book to prove, in Darwinian terms, that rapists are just as biologically justified as those who choose not to rape.
That there is obviously some evolutionary basis to rape, just like there is some evolutionary basis to all aspects of living things. In the book, we narrow it down to two plausible scientific evolutionary reasons for why we are a species in which rape occurs. One is just a byproduct of evolved differences between the sexualities of males and females. Or two, rape might be an adaptation. There might have been selection favoring males who raped under some circumstances in the past, and therefore there might be some aspects of male brains designed specifically to rape under some conditions.
Amazingly, with a stroke of honesty, he admitted that the moral relativism in evolution cannot take credit as the restraining force against rape and other crimes in our society. He credits it to the moral codes of the Bible. He also said that the weakening of the Christian tradition is to blame for the present decay in the world.
This may surprise you, but I actually think religion has a good effect on people because it has been the way that generation after generation has passed down moral codes. I would agree that there is a correlation between powerful Christian traditions
and the lowering of all kinds of crimes, maybe particularly sexual crimes. And I would agree that in our society we have seen Christian traditions weakened, and that weakening of Christianity is a factor responsible for the increase in rape and sexual crimes and violence, murder in our schools, which you've mentioned. So there is maybe a small point of agreement here. The downside is that my view tends to, you would say it has to, diminish the role of religion. And I think that religion does make people more cooperative, more self-restrained, nicer, altruistic.
Relativism, the moral philosophy that no absolutes exist, no purpose, no truth, and no meaning, is deadly to civilization. And accept people as they are is axiomatic of barbarism. With subjective truth, no one can ever be wrong, since there is no standard for right and wrong. As long as something is true, to those who hold that it is true, even if it's wrong for someone else. Relativism justifies Lucifer's rebellion and converts his lies into the truth. This violates the law of God and the law of non-contradiction. Opposite claims of truth cannot both be true. For example, if an atheist believes God does not exist and a theist believes God does exist, it is impossible for both to be right. The claims of Christ and Lucifer cannot both be true. People cannot differentiate between evil and good if they believe in relativism. Relativism is an effective method that Satan uses to silence people who are speaking the truth. Today you are called intolerant if you don't subscribe to relativism. One has to wonder if atheists like Barker give much thought to the possible consequences of their worldview.
Relativism is all we've got. Human values are not absolute. They are relative to human needs. The humanistic answer to morality, if the question is properly understood, is that the basis for values lies in nature. Since we are a part of nature, and since there is nothing beyond nature, it is necessary to assign value to actions in the context of nature itself.
Relativism is not a stable foundation for ethics, and many relativists do not fully live out their relativism. Now and then they borrow from Yahweh's objective values to preserve their sanity. Janet Richards made this interesting observation about relativists.
Relativism is an essentially unstable and slippery position. Anyone who reaches that stage should really be a total moral skeptic and deny that there is any real right or wrong, any good or evil at all. The fact that people do not often do this and try to go down the relativist path of hanging on to bits and pieces of objective ethics while denying their existence is interesting in itself.
Barker is not alone in his hackneyed morals. Dawkins is also on board.
Is it always wrong to put a terminally ill patient out of her misery at her own request? Is it always wrong to make love to a member of your own sex? Is it always wrong to kill an embryo? There are those who believe so, and their grounds are absolute. Morals do not have to be absolute. We could each make up our own definition of the good and behave accordingly. Nature is not cruel, only pitilessly indifferent. This is one of the hardest lessons for humans to learn. We cannot admit that things might be neither good nor evil, neither cruel nor kind, but simply callous, indifferent to all suffering, lacking all purpose. In a universe of blind physical forces and genetic replication, some people are going to get hurt, other people are going to get lucky, and you won't find any rhyme or reason in it, nor any justice. The universe we observe had precisely the properties we should expect if there is, at bottom, no design, no purpose, no evil, and no good. Nothing but blind, pitiless indifference.
The result of evolutionary pantheism is nihilism. The new atheists reject the gospel for the rootless and hopeless doctrine of evolution, which bears Satan's image. We need to beware of the false prophets of atheism. The pure, coherent message of the gospel teaches us to reject evil and embrace righteousness. Jesus taught his followers how to recognize false teachers by examining their unclean experience that their teachings produce.
Beware of false prophets, which come to you in sheep's clothing, but inwardly they are ravening wolves. Ye shall know them by their fruits. Do men gather grapes of thorns or figs of thistles? Even so, every good tree bringeth forth good fruit, but a corrupt tree bringeth forth evil fruit. A good tree cannot bring forth evil fruit, neither can a corrupt tree bring forth good fruit. Every tree that bringeth not forth good fruit is hewn down and cast into the fire. Wherefore by their fruits ye shall know them.
Pantheistic philosophies are leading society into moral decay. The Bible says that
Evil men and seducers shall wax worse and worse, deceiving and being deceived.
The secretive agenda of Satan makes him impossible to detect without close examination of our culture through the words of God. The Bible warns us to safeguard our minds from the deception of the devil.
Keep thy heart with all diligence, for out of it are the issues of life.
Aleister Crowley, also known as the Great Beast, was an influential English occultist, mystic and ceremonial magician, responsible for founding the religious philosophy of Thelema. At noon on April 8, 1904, Aleister Crowley began to transcribe the first chapter of the Book of the Law, as told to him by a demon spirit named Iwa. The agenda promoted by evolutionists leads to Crowley's synopsis of his spirit-driven book.
Do what thou wilt shall be the whole of the law. There is no law beyond do what thou wilt.
All pantheistic systems, whether scientific or other forms of pantheism, good and evil is subjective. Schaeffer brings to our attention the moral dilemma that confronts the scientific pantheist.
But whatever form pan-everythingism takes, including the modern scientific form which reduces everything to energy particles, it always has the same problem. In all of them, the end is the impersonal. Morals under every form of pantheism have no meaning as morals, for everything in pan-everythingism is finally equal. Modern theology must move towards situational ethics, because there's no such thing as morals in this setting. The word morals is used, but it is really only a word.
Yahweh is against Lucifer's pan-everythingism, which lurks behind the ancient gods and goddesses that we embrace through the outlet of Darwin's mystery religion. Moral relativism or pan-everythingism removes all boundaries that makes a distinction between good and evil. Rebellion against God's law is the familiar spirit in all false teachings, despite how it's presented. The barbarism of ancient civilizations was propelled by their pantheistic myths, says Professor John Oswald.
In myth, there is no single standard of ethics. There are many gods and goddesses, and each of these gods had varying likes and dislikes. Furthermore, the visible world did not come into existence as a result of any divine will or purpose. As a result, it becomes impossible to say that there is a single standard of right and wrong that is everywhere applicable. What one God wants, another God hates. So it is clear there cannot be any single standard of ethical behavior that had some universal divine warrant behind it. There can be no boundaries between parent and child, hence incest. There can be no boundaries around marriage, hence prostitution. There can be no boundaries between members of the same sex, hence homosexual behavior. There can be no boundaries between humans and animals, hence bestiality. All these practices were told and acted out in the myths.
From what we just read, relativism seems to be a primordial heresy that was played out by the ancient polytheistic religions. The gods were immoral. Absolutes did not exist among them. There was only the will of the gods that had nothing to do with what is right or wrong.
Woe to them that call evil good and good evil, that put darkness for light and light for darkness, that put bitter for sweet and sweet for bitter. Every man did that which was right in his own eyes.
The secret power of lawless pantheism has continued unabated since the time of Christ. In the days of Noah, skeptics rebelling against God was commonplace. They rejected the preaching of Noah and relied upon man-made philosophy as a substitute. There was no hope for the chronic cavillers that were acting out their evil. Because of their evil, God had to surgically remove them by a worldwide flood.
And God saw that the wickedness of man was great in the earth, and that every imagination of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. The earth also was corrupt before God, and the earth was filled with violence. And God looked upon the earth, and behold, it was corrupt, for all flesh had corrupted his way upon the earth. And God said unto Noah, The end of all flesh is come before me, for the earth is filled with violence through them. And behold, I will destroy them with the earth.
Christ compared the end times to the days of Noah, where lawlessness would be the standard and pantheistic evolution is the fuel.
But as the days of Noah were, so shall also the coming of the Son of Man be. For as in the days that were before the flood, they were eating and drinking, marrying and giving in marriage,
until the day that Noah entered into the ark, and knew not until the flood came, and took them all away. So shall also the coming of the Son of Man be.
The ability to discern both good and evil seems to be comparatively missing in society. As a result, we are ready for doctrines such as the relativity of truth and situation ethics. 2,000 years ago, the Roman governor of Palestine, Pontius Pilate, cross-examined Jesus before his crucifixion. Pilate asked Jesus if he was a king. Jesus proclaimed that everyone that is of the truth heareth my voice. To this, Pilate replied, "What is truth?" and right away left Jesus to address the Jews who wanted Christ crucified. The rejection of truth has consequences that should be our concern. Summarizing the Pilate encounter with Jesus, Fulton Sheen, an American archbishop, lists some of the repercussions of rejecting the truth.
Then he, Pilate, turned his back on the truth, better not on it, but on him who is truth. It remained to be seen that tolerance of truth and error in a stroke of broad-mindedness leads to intolerance and persecution. What is truth? When sneered, is followed up with a second sneer, what is justice? Broad-mindedness, when it means indifference to right and wrong, eventually ends in a hatred of what is right. He who was also so tolerant of error as to deny an absolute truth was the one who would crucify truth. It was the religious judge who challenged him. I adjure thee. But the secular judge asked, what is truth? He who was in the robe of the high priest called upon God the things that are God's. He who was in the Roman toga just professed a skepticism and doubt.
In the days of Isaiah, his complaint was that judgment is turned away backward and justice standeth afar off. For truth is fallen in the street, and equity cannot enter. The truth should be told, whether popular or unpopular, whether legal or outlawed. Naturalistic pantheism, which involves a type of religious attitude different from that of monotheism, implies that all is holy, because all includes the bad as well as the good. The term holiness is interpreted differently by naturalistic pantheists and monotheists. This goes back to the Garden of Eden, when Satan, through the medium of a serpent, introduced the knowledge of good and evil.
And the serpent said unto the woman, For God doth know that in the day ye eat thereof, then your eyes shall be opened, and ye shall be as gods, knowing good and evil.
The fact that holy includes negative as well as positive values is something that naturalistic pantheism shares with polytheistic religions. The Greek Homeric religion, the ancient Egyptian religion, the Babylonian religion, and so forth all imply that deities do evil things as well as good, and that the holy character of these deities embraces their evil dispositions as much as their good. If good and evil is part of the theology of the gods, then Satan and Yahweh are equally God. Esoterically speaking, both are worthy of worship. Satan's master plan is unfolding through the teachings of evolution. If materialism is true, there is no such thing as good and evil. If matter and energy are all that exist, what is goodness? What about evil? Are they matter or energy? They are neither, and so they do not really exist. We are left with pantheism as an anchor for ethics. Darwinian materialism cannot account for morality because ethics are not derived from matter that can be weighed or measured. Norman Geisler and Frank Turek put forth this argument against natural selection evolving morality.
Darwinism asserts that only materials exist, but materials don't have morality. How much does hate weigh? Is there an atom for love? What's the chemical composition of the murder molecule? These questions are meaningless because physical particles are not responsible for morality. Human thoughts and transcendent moral laws are not material things any more than the laws of logic and mathematics are material things. They are immaterial entities that cannot be weighed or physically measured. As a result, they can't be explained in material terms by natural selection or any other atheistic means.
Materialism is an unlivable philosophy. Its adherents live contrary to their worldview. Robert Morey notes that
materialists cannot logically believe in love, yet they fall in love and marry. They cannot believe in mind. yet they cannot avoid using mind terminology in their speech when referring to themselves or others. They believe that man is a random swarm of non-rational atoms no different than stones, yet they value people and relationships. They cannot treat their children or mates as random atoms. What they say in the classroom is therefore contradicted by how they live in the home. They experience the mysteries and beauty of this world and man while denying that such things exist. Materialism is not faith to live by and die by. It is unlivable on a consistent basis because it is merely a philosophy of negation in which anything that is worth living or dying for is negated.
The new atheist seeks the elusive life of disinterested altruism, something that is wanting in the system of evolution. In other words, the type of altruism that represents the real conundrum of philosophy and science, the disinterested altruism that regards other people as ends in themselves, can never be fully clarified by any biological explanation, since it so clearly opposes all biological and natural processes. Dawkins admits the following about the grim master behind evolution that he is seeking hopelessly to evade.
We look on the dark side and assume that individual man is fundamentally selfish. We can even discuss ways of deliberately cultivating and nurturing pure, disinterested altruism, something that has no place in nature, something that has never existed before in the whole history of the world.
According to Dawkins, evolution has been never able to produce the disinterested altruism that he seeks to cultivate. This is a hopeless pursuit since evolution decides for us what traits are feasible for the environment we live in. And so far, according to him, evolution did not signal it's time to produce that virtue. The brutal fact is that the doctrine of evolution leads its disciples into bondage. The new atheists promise liberty while they themselves are locked into sin. The Apostle Peter dealt with the moral skeptics of his day when he said,
"While they promise them liberty, they themselves are the servants of corruption, whom a man is overcome, of the same as he brought in bondage."
In Darwinian terms, people who commit adultery or have polygamous relationships are just as biologically justified as men or women who remain faithful to their spouses. Another evil spawned from the primordial soup of Darwinism was an Indiana University zoologist and sexual deviant Alfred Kinsey. Kinsey's two books, Sexual Behavior in the Human Male, published in 1948, and Sexual Behavior in the Human Female, which followed in 1952, started what is now referred to as the sexual revolution. This revolution is more than just a change in attitude. It's a business, a multi-billion-dollar business. Kinsey set out to conduct a study that would reinforce his own liberal attitude to sexuality, not because of pure scientific motives, but because of his atheism and his belief in the Darwinian view that humans were merely animals and morality was repressive. West paints an accurate picture of this immoral monster.
Kinsey treated the human animal as merely another type of mammal whose mating behavior could be fully explicated in terms of biology and conditioning. His ultimate goal was to refashion human sexual morality according to the standard of normal mammalian behavior. Kinsey suggested that opposition to bestiality originated in superstition and encouraged doctors and psychologists to assure young men who engaged in the practice of the normality of their behavior.
Dr. Judith Reisman, in a thought-provoking book, Kinsey, Crimes and Consequences, exposed Kinsey's fraudulent research. In an article published in Whistleblower magazine, she touched upon Kinsey's research on the sexual behavior of children.
Kinsey solicited and encouraged pedophiles at home and abroad to sexually violate from 317 to 2,035 infants and children for his alleged data on normal child sexuality. Many of the crimes against children, oral and anal sodomy, genital intercourse, and manual abuse, committed for Kinsey's research are quantified in his own graphs and charts. For example, Table 34 on page 180 of Kinsey's Sexual Behavior in the Human Male claims to be a scientific record of multiple orgasms in pre-adolescent males. Here, infants as young as 5 months were timed with a stopwatch for orgasm by Kinsey's technically trained aides, with one 4-year-old tested 24 consecutive hours for an alleged 26 orgasms. Sex educators, pedophiles, and their advocates commonly quote these child data to prove children's need for homosexual, heterosexual, and bisexual satisfaction
via safe sex education. These data are also regularly used to prove children are sexual from birth.
Kinsey's research left an indelible mark on society, even motivating Hugh Hefner to create his Playboy enterprise. The impact of evolutionary psychology's approach to sexuality in popular culture can also be seen in David Kupelian's best-selling book, The Marketing of Evil.
To sum it up, today virtually everything having to do with sex, from attitudes towards extramarital affairs and homosexuality to the nation's sex education curricula, to the ways medicine, psychiatry, psychology, and even the criminal justice system define and deal with sexual pathology, is rooted firmly in the ludicrously fraudulent data of Kinsey and his cult of criminally deviant sex researchers.
Underlining the sexual revolution was a cancerous relativism where Lucifer increased his power over humanity.
Kinsey even questioned whether scientists should continue to employ such labels as normal and abnormal or natural and unnatural, since these were often used as terms of moral approval or condemnation. Whatever the moral interpretation, there is no scientific reason for considering particular types of sexual activity as intrinsically, in their biological origins, normal or abnormal, he wrote. Science could reveal the facts of human sexual behavior. It could not tell people which forms of sexual behavior were good or bad.
For many people, the underlying motive for believing in evolution is to escape the guilt that comes with sin. It justified their unbridled sexual desires, which brought havoc to ancient civilizations. Aldous Huxley shares his reason for rejecting God.
I had motives for not wanting the world to have a meaning. Consequently, I assumed that it had none, and was able without any difficulty to find satisfying reasons for this assumption. For myself, as no doubt for most of my contemporaries, the philosophy of meaninglessness was essentially an instrument of liberation. The liberation we desired was liberation from a certain system of morality. We objected to the morality because it interfered with our sexual freedom.
The Bible condemns the practices of sexual miscreants. They are not allowed into the kingdom of heaven. Even if they had a pass, they would not enjoy paradise. Darwin's philosophy of evolution is in accord with the Church of Satan. LaVey set forth the principles to be a Satanist.
The basics of Satanism have always existed. The only thing that is new is the formal organization of religion based on the universal traits of man. For centuries, magnificent structures of stone, concrete, mortar, and steel have been devoted to man's abstinence. It is high time that human beings stopped fighting themselves and devoted their time to building temples designed for man's indulgences. Even though times have changed and always will, man remains basically the same. For 2,000 years, man has done penance for something he should have never had to feel guilty about in the first place. We are tired of denying ourselves the pleasures of life which we deserve. Why not have a religion based on indulgence? Certainly it is consistent with the nature of the beast. We are no longer supplicating weaklings trembling before an unmerciful God who cares not whether we live or die. We are self-respecting, prideful people. We are Satanists.
Darwin is elevated as the patron saint of Satanism. LaVey's fellow Satanist Burton Wolfe, who wrote the introduction to his book in 1976, mentions Darwin's influence on the Church of Satan.
It is not an easy religion to adopt in a society ruled so long by Puritan ethics. There is no false altruism or mandatory love thy neighbor concept in this religion. Satanism is a blatantly selfish, brutal philosophy. It is based on the belief that human beings are inherently selfish, violent creatures, that life is a Darwinian struggle for survival of the fittest, that only the strong survive, and the earth will be ruled by those who fight to win the ceaseless competition that exists in all jungles, including those of urbanized society. Abhor this brutal outlook if you will. It is based, as it had been for centuries, on real conditions that exist in the world we inhabit rather than the mystical lands of milk and honey depicted in the Christian Bible.
God made us in His image. Satan convinced the world that we evolved from animals. Look into the animal kingdom to understand our past, justify our evil.
Satan represents man just as another animal, sometimes better, more often worse than those who walk on all fours, who, because of his divine spiritual and intellectual development, has become the most vicious animal of all.
Satan is acting out his rebellion in Darwin's philosophy. America's leading secular humanist, Paul Kurtz, exasperated with the wickedness of the moral decline in society, also seeks his utopia in a maze instead of his creator. In a debate with Christian philosopher William Lane Craig, he stated,
I submit we cannot look back to ancient documents, the Bible, for simple moral recipes. We have to draw upon wisdom that is relevant to the modern world, and we need to look ahead to the world of the future. We need to look beyond the intransigent, intolerant attitudes of the past and develop a new global humanism that transcends the ancient dogmas that divide people. Can we find such common ground? Is it possible to formulate ethical principles upon which we can agree? This, of course, is the great question of our time.
Kurt's interest in pursuing genuine altruism while rejecting the Bible can be compared to an anarchist who, after overthrowing the established order, then starts to complain about the excessive disorder in society. The point, completely lost by the modern atheists, is that when you strike down Christianity, its morality necessarily goes with it. German atheist philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche candidly professed this.
When one gives up the Christian faith, one pulls the right to Christian morality out from under one's feet. This morality is by no means self-evident. This point has to be exhibited again and again despite the English flatheads. Christianity is a system, a whole view of things thought out together. By breaking one main concept out of it, the faith in God, one breaks the whole. Nothing necessary remains in one's hands. Christianity presupposes that man does not know, cannot know what is good for him, what is evil. He believes in God who alone knows it. Christian morality is a command. Its origin is transcendent. It is beyond all criticism, all right to criticism. It has truth only if God has truth. It stands or falls with faith in God.
Unlike today's celebrity atheist, Nietzsche was a consistent atheist who was prepared to face the repercussions of rejecting Christianity. In 1889, Nietzsche went mad, spending the last 11 years of his life in a permanent state of catatonia. Professor Adler takes to task the hypocritical double standard of atheists who try to incorporate biblical morality while rejecting its author. He contends that morality is not binding, nor does it hinge on the philosophical foundation of evolution. It is borrowed from the person of Christ, whose existence they deny.
We are all guilty of hypocrisy if we believe that Darwin is right and that at the same time go on acting as if he were wrong, enjoying the privileges of human dignity, even demanding those privileges, but at the same time denying the very facts on which that dignity and its privileges are based.
There are no morals that are binding in the Darwinian scheme of things. Is it a felony when an eagle kills a field mouse? Immorality, crime, malice, and cruelty belong to the higher forms of life. Chimpanzees and other primates sometimes show behavior that appears malicious, but they are higher animals. Higher does not mean better. It means perhaps more complex, conscious, cultural, or more human. Animals have no moral obligations to one another. The point is forcefully illustrated by ethicist Richard Taylor, who invites us to imagine living in a state of nature without any customs or laws.
Such actions, though injurious to their victims, are no more unjust or immoral than they would be if done by one animal to another. A hawk that seizes a fish from the sea kills it, but does not murder it, and another hawk that seizes the fish from the talons of the first takes it, but does not steal it, for none of these things is forbidden. And exactly the same considerations apply to the people we are imagining.
According to the survival of the fittest motive, the strong survive and the weak perish. If we were to live off Darwinism to the letter, institutions to help the weak would not be in existence. On the other hand, if they are allowed to exist, the unfit would be sterilized. It is worthwhile to revisit the words of Darwin on the point of the preservation of the weak.
With savages, the weak in body or mind are soon eliminated, and those that survive commonly exhibit a vigorous state of health. We civilized men, on the other hand, do our utmost to check the process of elimination. We build asylums for the imbecile, the maimed, and the sick. We institute poor laws, and our medical men exert their utmost skill to save the life of everyone to the last moment. Thus, the weak members of our civilized societies propagate their kind. No one who has attended to the breeding of domestic animals will doubt that this must be highly injurious to the race of man. Hardly anyone is so ignorant as to allow his worst animals to breed.
James Owen's article in the National Geographic News shows that evolutionists acknowledge this moral dilemma.
Of course, we humans have disrupted our own natural evolution. Medicinal drugs, education, and rule of law have largely eliminated the survival of the fittest process, yet this doesn't trouble Dawkins.
Since the article on Dawkins was called Evolution's High Priest, you would think he would be faithful to his lawless religion. He is not. Here is a quote from his hypocritical sermon.
Most of us have had our lives saved by medical science, probably more than once, and I am all for it, he said in the interview. As an academic scientist, I am a passionate Darwinian, in the sense that I believe Darwinian natural selection is the explanation for all life. But as a citizen, I am an anti-Darwinian. I do not want to see the ruthless callousness of natural selection taking its toll of human life and happiness.
Here we have it from the mouth of this high priest of evolution. He promotes Darwinism in his books. Yet on a personal level, he's anti-Darwin because according to him, it takes a toll on human life and happiness. This is a good enough reason to oppose and reject evolution. The pantheistic religion of evolution robs you of the hope and peace offered by Jesus Christ.
Peace I leave with you, my peace I give unto you. Not as the world giveth, give I unto you. Let not your heart be troubled, neither let it be afraid.
The Bible empowers us to live an unselfish life, which is at odds with evolution.
In everything I did, I showed you that by this kind of hard work we must help the weak, remembering the words the Lord Jesus himself said, "It is more blessed to give than to receive." As we have therefore opportunity, let us do good unto all men.
Fairness and equality are not part of Darwin's theory of evolution. It's at war with Christ's following words.
And as ye would that men should do to you, do ye also to them likewise.
Harris, sensing the horrific outcome of his monkey ethics, consoles himself by looking at the few instances in which monkeys act in self-denial for the clan.
Our ethical intuitions must have their precursors in the natural world, for while nature is indeed red in tooth and claw, it is not merely so. Even monkeys will undergo extraordinary privations to avoid causing harm to another member of their species.
Since our morals are not anchored in objective moral principles, brutality and murder can be beneficial in some instances. In an effort to counter the common misconceptions about his theory, Darwin wrote The Descent of Man, in which he expressed his own views about the moral implications of human evolution. To recall a startling relativistic passage by Darwin, consider the implications of what he said.
If, for instance, men were reared under precisely the same conditions as hive bees, there can hardly be a doubt that our unmarried females would, like the worker bees, think it a sacred duty to kill their brothers, and mothers would strive to kill their fertile daughters, and no one would think of interfering.
The Bible has been substituted for Satan's jungle ethics of survival, which can be summarized in John West's poignant summary.
According to Darwin, specific moral precepts develop merely because under certain environmental conditions, they promote survival. But once the conditions for survival change, so too do the dictates of morality. That is why we find in nature both the maternal instinct and infanticide, both courage and cowardice, both honor and treachery. In short, natural selection chooses whatever traits best promote survival under the existing circumstances. Sometimes it will include shocking immoralities. Presumably, even antisocial behaviors such as fraud and pedophilia must continue to exist among human beings because they were favored at some point by natural selection and therefore have some sort of biological basis. While we can say that desires to perpetuate fraud or engage in pedophilia are not right for those of us who do not have those desires, on what basis do we morally condemn those who do hold such desires? Their desires were implanted in them by natural selection in the same way our desires were implanted in us. And who are we to condemn what nature has sanctioned? As a matter of self-preservation, we certainly can try to stop such behaviors by force if we have sufficient power to do so. But that is not the same thing as being able to condemn pedophiles or tax cheats as morally blameworthy.
This is Satan's way of justifying himself for rebelling against God. If evolution justifies both good and evil, then pantheism frees Lucifer from being an aberration of Yahweh's creation. Dawkins acknowledges that in the Darwinian point of view, niceness dies a Darwinian death.
If we translate the colloquial meaning of nice guy into its Darwinian equivalent, a nice guy is an individual that assists other members of its species at its own expense to pass their genes on to the next generation. Niceness dies a Darwinian death.
True altruism involves doing favors without expectation of return. If we had evolved by the cutthroat competition that natural selection seems to involve, then we could not exist unless we had, deep in our nature, a ruthless determination to put our own interests first. This is what D'Souza was getting at when he said,
Quite possibly evil predominates in this mixture, but that may not be apparent to us. A whole body of scientific and psychological scholarship shows that beneath the motives that we admit to ourselves, there are often less admirable motives at work. Even our good motives, such as pity and compassion, may be derived from feelings of superiority and condescension we are reluctant to acknowledge. Evolutionary psychology shows that apparent acts of generosity may be in fact propelled by selfish motives of self-aggrandizement and self-perpetuation. I'm not saying that human nature is bereft of virtue. The propensity for good is certainly there, but so is the propensity for vice and evil. The question for secular morality is, in seeking the inner self, which self are you seeking? What principle do you have that distinguishes the good inner self from the bad inner self?
Darwin undermined the Christian claim that human beings alone are moral. He proposed that human sense is an expansion of social instincts, kinships, and cooperation common to many social animals. He claimed that human sympathy is not vastly superior to the range of concern exhibited in animal altruism. We can learn a great deal about morality of Darwinism by examining some of the traits in the animal kingdom. Animals' behavior are not guided by moral codes as do humans. Satan tricked us into looking at animals to learn about ourselves instead of the perfect law of liberty. God allowed Satan's character to be imprinted in the animal kingdom to teach us that lawlessness leads to chaos. Herman Saini asserts that
the animal world we see today is patterned after Satan's philosophy of survival of the fittest, and not according to God's way of love. God's purpose in allowing Satan to order and rule the animal world was that human beings would learn what Satan's way of greed, competition, and violence leads to, without having to experience it themselves. It leads to lives filled with terror, uncertainty, pain, suffering, anguish, violence, and death. That is how the animal world lives. God will demonstrate the peace, tranquility, safety, and security that result from His way of life when in His kingdom the nature of even wild animals will be changed.
John Cartwright is Senior Lecturer and Teaching Fellow of the University of Chester, where he teaches courses in evolutionary psychology, genetics, and animal behavior. In his book, Evolution and Human Behavior, he states that there is no such biblical altruism as a good Samaritan, and love thy neighbor as thyself has no place in evolution. This can be only manifested from an outside source rather than natural selection.
In the Gospel according to Luke, Jesus illustrated the biblical injunction to love thy neighbor as thyself with the parable of the Good Samaritan. Although humans often fall short of their ideals, the fact that we do offer help to the needy irrespective of race, class, or creed poses a special problem for Darwinian psychology.
The cruelty of the survival of the fittest, where the strong survive at the expense of the weak, is the antithesis of love. The two are not compatible and cannot coexist. Evolution justifies whatever run-of-the-mill standard it suggests to an upward march. To call it a standard is a contradiction of the term, because a standard remains fixed, like the objective moral law in the Bible. Since it rejects the Ten Commandments, the evolutionary double standard throughout history required for sustenance every known evil that the Bible condemns. Frederick Davenport, in his study of mental and social evolution of religious revival, maintains that,
for instance, it is declared with some justice that we are under the dominion of a too radical evolutionary theory of sin. Evil is only good in the making, and why agonize over it as the fathers did? The great process will go on. The survival of the fittest means ultimately the survival of the best. The generations that follow will be somewhat better than the generations that are gone, and therefore why stir men's souls to white heat about sin and righteousness and judgment to come? and revivals have declined because the sense of sin has been weakened in the population. It is an argument which is worthy of attention, for whatever its intellectual faults, the old-time revival did often make a wicked man think of his sin and agonize over it too, until frequently he was ready to throw all his strength into the struggle against its power.
Dawkins is one of the most aggressive promoters today of scientific pantheism. He admits that the morality he proclaims did not come from his lawless religion of evolution.
I am not advocating a morality based on evolution.
The morality that skeptics are advocating that are in accord with the Bible is based on absolutes, to communicate God's ethical imperatives into a relativistic context, neutralizes its power on the conscience. In so doing, evil angels are leading people down the path of ruin. The meaninglessness of life might sound depressing, and many people will refuse to believe that their lives have no cosmic significance. But an even more depressing outcome of the Darwinian worldview is that, other than feelings of affection or the possibility of some mutual benefit, we have no provable cosmic reason to care about each other. And other than the fear of punishment or rejection, or the perception of personal gain, there is no reason to follow the rules and values of society. Despite any idealistic claims, the scientific worldview supports no philosophical justification for unconditional cooperation or personal self-sacrifice. Satan is presently marshalling his Armageddon forces to wage war against Yahweh and his plan of salvation. Freemason Herbert Wells knew the damaging impact evolution have upon the Bible.
If all animals and man evolved, then there were no first parents, no paradise, no fall. And if there had been no fall, then the entire historic fabric of Christianity, the story of the first sin, and the reason for the atonement collapses like a house of cards.
Dennett writes about the fantasy of a universal acid as a liquid so corrosive that it would eat through anything it came into contact with, even a potential container. Such a powerful substance would transform everything it was applied to, leaving something very different in its wake. This is where Dennett draws parallels from the universal acid to Darwin's idea.
It eats through just about every traditional concept and leaves in its wake a revolutionized worldview, with most of the old landmarks still recognizable, but transformed in fundamental ways.
These two systems bear the character of Christ and Satan. Evolution can be linked to the breaking down of society's morals due to its war with Christianity, the only ethical system that can change people's lives for the better. The only thing evolving from Darwinism is Satan's agenda. Natural selection has no foresight. When feathers first evolved, this was not in order to prepare the way for the evolution of wings. Feathers just happened to evolve for one reason, and it has so happened that this provided the material for the evolution of wings. Natural selection designs wonderful things, but has no plans. For this reason, Dawkins has described it as a blind watchmaker.
Natural selection, the blind, unconscious, automatic process which Darwin discovered, and which we now know is the explanation for the existence and apparent purposeful form of all life, has no purpose in mind. It has no mind and no mind's eye. It does not plan for the future. It has no vision, no foresight, no sight at all. If it can be said to play the role of watchmaker in nature, it is the blind watchmaker.
Since the human mind developed by natural selection and chance mutations, how can we trust our minds? Darwin contemplated this conundrum with a horrid doubt whether convictions of man's mind, which has been developed from lower animals, are at all trustworthy. He said in his letter to William Graham, a philosopher and political economist,
But then, with me, the horrid doubt always arises whether the convictions of man's mind, which has been developed from the mind of the lower animals, are of any value or at all trustworthy. Would anyone trust in the convictions of a monkey's mind, if there are any convictions in such a mind?
Alvin Plantinga, a professor and analytic philosopher, commenting on Darwin's doubt, said,
Call this Darwin's doubt. Now, naturalism entails that evolution, if it occurs, is indeed unguided. But then, so the suggestion goes, it is unlikely that our cognitive faculties are reliable. If that's true, she will also have a defeater for any belief produced by her cognitive faculties, all of them, naturally enough. She is therefore committed to a deep and pervasive skepticism.
The secular materialistic view of reality states that the universe is the product of chance or pure contingency. Everything that is an accident. Everything is the product of chaos. In an impersonal chance universe where chaos, flux, and randomness are king, personality, meaning, and the universal laws of logic clearly have no place. If this secular evolutionary worldview is true, then your life and existence have no meaning whatsoever. You are nothing more than an accumulation of atoms randomly floating in the void. Your thoughts, desires, relationships, love, and deepest concerns are merely the illusions of chemical electronic impulses. You are an impersonal machine. These statements are the logical implications of the secular humanistic worldview. All talk of love, justice, and meaning, and helping your fellow man are holdovers from the Christian worldview. What is necessary for human logic to be useful and even possible? For reason or logic to be of any use to man, it must be unchanging. What do unchanging laws of logic presuppose? They presuppose an ordered universe. They presuppose an all-powerful God who controls all created reality. They presuppose an absolute unchanging God who stands behind and is the sustainer of all created reality. They presuppose that God created man in his image with a certain non-evolving fixed nature. Man is not plastic, evolving being, but a created, rational being. The secular humanistic worldview where everything is in flux, including man, makes unchanging laws of logic an impossibility. The only unchanging law in such a system is that everything is changing. When the secular humanist uses reason or logic in order to argue against the Christian God, he must steal from the Christian worldview. In order to do so, he must presuppose the Christian view of reality and the Christian view of man in order to use logic. Since the laws of logic are themselves not open to empirical observation any more than God, who is pure spirit, secular humanists have no more reason, according to their own presuppositions, to believe that logic exists than that God exists. Therefore, their arguments against the God who has revealed himself in the Bible are arbitrary and inconsistent. Professor Sayer nuked the humanists' faulty foundation when he said,
Here's a curious case. If Darwin's naturalism is true, there is no way of even establishing its credibility, let alone proving it. Confidence in logic is ruled out. Darwin's own theory of human origins must therefore be accepted by an act of faith. One must hold that a brain, a device that came to be through natural selection and chance-sponsored mutations, can actually know a proposition or a set of propositions to be true. What we need for such certainty is the existence of some rational spirit outside both ourselves and nature from which our own rationality could derive. Theism assumes such a ground. Naturalism does not.
Palmer, Dawkins, Hitchens, Dennett, and Harris teach evolution as an alternative to Christianity. However, their personal lives reflect a diluted form of evolution, sensing the madness in their philosophy. There are no purebred evolutionists in the world today. Nietzsche was the closest to fulfilling the dictates of evolution. Insanity awaited him at the height of his experience. The doctrine of scientific pantheism in the form of evolution is irrational. Theism is a more rational worldview that free us from the deceptions of the devil. James Sayer argues,
Virtually no one is a full-fledged epistemological nihilist, yet naturalism does not allow a person to have any solid reason for confidence in human reason. We thus end in an ironic paradox. Naturalism, born in the Age of Enlightenment, was launched on a firm acceptance of the human ability to know. Now naturalists find that they can place no confidence in their knowing.
Faced with the evidence of a finely tuned universe, some scientists devoid of God's revelation find it tenable to believe in an unidentified creative intelligence. Theoretical physicist Tony Rothman is one example.
When confronted with the order and beauty of the universe and the strange coincidences of nature, it's very tempting to take the leap of faith from science into religion. I am sure many physicists want to. I only wish they would admit it.
Chuck Missler and Mark Eastman wrote about the change of worldview among atheists from a universe created by chance to intelligent design.
The evidence for a finite, decaying, and finely tuned universe has led many to conclude that there must be a mind behind it all. Remarkably, many of these men are professed atheists who have been forced by the weight of 20th century discoveries in astronomy and physics to concede the existence of an intelligent designer behind the creation of the universe.
Satan knew it is a matter of time before some of his dogmatic scientists would switch from preaching materialistic pantheism to Alfred Wallace's occult substitute. His second carefully laid plan was to become God by slowly revealing himself as the intelligence behind evolution. Rejecting the biblical account of Christ as the Creator leaves you vulnerable to Satan's substitute Christ.
For by him were all things created, that are in heaven and are in the earth, visible and invisible, whether they be thrones, or dominions, or principalities, or powers. All things were created by him and for him. I am come in my Father's name, and ye receive me not. If another shall come in his own name, him ye will receive.
However, in reality, the underpinnings of Darwin's mystery religion is definitely not undirected, but secretly driven by devils. There is a guiding intelligence behind evolution that is satanic in nature. Occultist Alice Bailey in 1922 wrote the following in her book, The Consciousness of the Atom.
Is there behind the objective form and its animating intelligence an evolution which corresponds to the I faculty, to the ego in man? Is there in nature and in all we see around us the working out of the purpose of an individualized self-conscious being? If there is such a being and such a fundamental existence, we should be able to see somewhat his intelligent activities and to watch his plans working towards fruition.
We have to be keen students of the Bible to detect the esoteric depths of Satan's mind, or his secretive nature, because, as Pike says,
the deity who hides himself from our senses and conceals from us the springs by which he moves the universe.
Evil angels are gathering the world together to war against Christ. Helena Blavatsky's perspective on evolution is that our evolution is not guided by blind forces, but we are unknowingly directed by spiritual intelligences.
The whole order of nature evinces a progressive march towards a higher life. There is design in the action of the seemingly blindest forces. The whole process of evolution, with its endless adaptations, is a proof of this. The immutable laws that weed out the weak and feeble species to make room for the strong, and which ensure the survival of the fittest, though so cruel in their immediate action, are all working toward the grand end. The very fact that adaptations do occur, that the fittest do survive in the struggle for existence, shows that what is called unconscious nature is in reality an aggregate of forces manipulated by semi-intelligent beings guided by high planetary spirits, whose collective aggregate forms the manifested verbum of the unmanifested logos and constitutes at one and the same time the mind of the universe and its immutable law.
Controversial author Howard Bloom examined history through his evolutionary worldview and came to this disturbing conclusion about the forces of nature used to restrict the freedom of the weak, suppress their individuality, or eliminate the weak altogether. He used the grisly example of eliminating the few dissenters to a global plan with the necessity of a daily dying of red blood cells to preserve life.
Over 200 billion red blood cells a day die in the interests of keeping you alive. Do you anguish over their demise? Like those red corpuscles, you and I are cells in a social superorganism whose maintenance and growth sometimes requires our pain or elimination, suppresses our individuality, and restricts our freedom.
This is the same spiritual communism or collective consciousness promoted in the New Age movement under the banner of monism. Bloom came to another appalling conclusion regarding the synthesis of evolution, which he calls the Lucifer principle.
The Lucifer principle is a complex of natural rules, each working together to weave a fabric that sometimes frightens and appalls us. Every one of the threads in that tapestry is fascinating, but the big picture is more astonishing still. At its heart, the Lucifer principle looks something like this. The nature scientists uncover has crafted our viler impulse into us. In fact, these impulses are a part of the process she uses to create. Lucifer is the dark side of the cosmic fecundity, the cutting blade of the sculptor's knife. Nature does not abhor evil, she embraces it. Death, destruction, and fury do not disturb the mother of our world. They are merely parts of her plan. Only we are outraged by the Lucifer principle's consequences. And we have every right to be, for we are casualties of nature's callous indifference to life, pawns who suffer and die to live out her schemes. One result: from our best qualities come our worst. From our urge to pull together comes our tendency to tear each other apart. From our devotion to a higher good comes our propensity for the foulest atrocities. From our commitment to ideals comes our excuse to hate. Since the beginning of history, we've been blinded by evil's ability to don a selfless disguise. We have failed to see that our finest qualities often lead us to the actions we most abhor: murder, torture, genocide, and war.
The Bible warns us that in the last days, before Christ's return, people will be living Darwin's lawless religion to the fullest.
This know also, that in the last days perilous times shall come. For men shall be lovers of their own selves, covetous, boasters, proud, blasphemers, disobedient to parents, unthankful, unholy, without natural affection, truce breakers, false accusers, incontinent, fierce, despisers of those that are good.
In such an environment, what would it take to be the fittest? According to natural selection, if the majority of society is evil and the way to pass on your genes to your progeny is through evil behavior, then natural selection looks upon the vilest among humans with favor. God's people who oppose the mystery of iniquity would be considered weak and unworthy of survival. They would be viewed as hindering the progress of evolution. Satan's scientific coup d'etat is bringing us one step closer to his age-old synthesis of substituting himself as the universal Messiah. In Darwin's mystery religion, we see Satan's plan to destroy the commandment-keeping people who have the testimony of Jesus. The dragon, the symbol of the devil, is against God's people, symbolized by a chaste woman.
And the dragon was wroth with the woman, and went to make war with the remnant of her seed, which keep the commandments of God, and have the testimony of Jesus Christ.
Atheism and secular humanism, guided by social Darwinism, has not done anything to uplift humanity into a utopia from their moral decline. In a real sense, their worldview propelled this moral decline. Paul Kurt and Edwin Wilson, the authors of the pretentious document The Humanist Manifesto 2, demonstrate this delusion.
We can discover no divine purpose or providence for the human species. Humans are responsible for what we are or will become. No deity will save us. We must save ourselves.
A professor of sociology, in his recent book, The Wreck of Western Culture, Humanism Revisited, documents the corrosive self-centered nature of secular humanism.
Humanism sought to turn the treasure-laden galleon of Western culture around. It attempted to replace God by man, put humans at the center of the universe, to deify them. Its ambition was to found an order on earth in which freedom and happiness prevailed without any transcendental or supernatural supports, an entirely human order.
Secular humanism, by removing God, has cast a snare of pseudo-divinity on its followers and left them with the impossible task of saving themselves. This is what Satan promised Eve in the Garden of Eden when he said, "Ye shall be as gods," implying that ye have no use for a supreme God. The wreckage of being independent of God, leading to the fall of humanity, is now fossilized as evidence for us to see. Carroll has written about the precarious results of reversing God's plan for humanity.
We live amidst the ruins of the great 500-year epic of humanism. Around us is the colossal wreck. Our culture is a flat expanse of rubble. Is it surprising that we are run down? We are desperate, yet don't care much anymore. We are timid, yet we cannot be shocked. We are inert underneath our busyness. We are destitute in our plenty. We are homeless in our own homes. What should be there to hold our hand is not. Our culture has absented itself. It has left us terribly alone.
The cause of this consternation is Satan and his army of evil angels. The path to peace comes from our Creator, who instills hope, courage, and serenity to his followers.
Come unto me, all ye that labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you, and learn of me, for I am meek and lowly in heart, and ye shall find rest unto your souls. For my yoke is easy, and my burden is light.
As we saw before, the battle between creationism and evolution is nothing new. The Apostle Paul found the Greek world to be saturated with evolution. The Epicureans and the Stoics' reaction to the gospel was typical of some evolutionists, even today. On the second missionary journey, Paul confronted men who held to these two philosophical malaria in the city of Athens.
Then certain philosophers of the Epicureans and of the Stoics encountered him, and some said, What will this babbler say? Others some, He seemeth to be a setter forth of strange gods, because he preached unto them Jesus and the resurrection.
The Epicureans represented one of the major schools of philosophy in Athens. Their school had been founded by Epicurus, who held that indulgence was the key to life, and that pleasure was the highest good. According to Epicurus, the pleasure most worth pursuing was a life of tranquility, free from passion and pain, free above all from superstitious fears, and in particular the fear of death. The Epicureans denied the existence of an afterlife. Epicurus would have been very comfortable with modern evolutionary cosmologists. The seeds of today's crass materialism were sown in the Epicurean assumptions that the whole of existence is made of atomic particles. In such a world of chaos, there could be neither purpose nor design. Epicureanism was essentially antichrist, for a creator was not necessary in the world originated with matter and chance. Therefore, it brushed aside all thought of sin or of accountability at a final judgment. Epicureanism based on evolution had created idolatry, immorality, and a pagan Greek culture. The next philosophical enemy of the gospel was the Stoics. The Stoics were the opposite. Their school of thought had been founded by Zeno of Cyprus, a contemporary with Epicurus. As far as the gods were concerned, the Stoics were fatalists and pantheists. God was the world's soul. The world was God's body. To the Stoics, there was no personal dealing with God. Their leading maxim was that man should live according to nature. Man should be above passion. He should be unmoved by joy or grief, pleasure or pain. Paul was pained by seeing the city of Athens given over to these idolatrous philosophies. Paul in Acts chapter 17 verse 22 to 34 refuted these tired arguments of the idolatry of Athens, Epicureans' evolutionary hedonism, and the Stoics' materialistic pantheism by pointing his audience to the creation story in Genesis, Table of Nations, the impending judgment, and the resurrection of the dead. He showed the lameness of idolatry and substituted with a more wholesome alternative of the gospel of Christ. The Sabbath was instituted in the Garden of Eden to be a memorial of creation. Every week when the Sabbath is kept, it communicates to our consciousness that Yahweh is our creator, sustainer, and sanctifier.
Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. 6 days shalt thou labor and do all thy work, but the seventh day is the Sabbath of our Lord thy God. In it thou shalt not do any work, thou, nor thy son, nor thy daughter, thy manservant, nor thy maidservant, nor thy cattle, nor thy stranger that is within thy gates. For in 6 days the Lord made heaven and earth, the sea, and all that in them is, and rested on the seventh day. Wherefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day, and hallowed it.
Of the 10, it is the only commandment that says remember, because Yahweh foresaw that it would be the most neglected and misunderstood. It refutes Satan's doctrine of pantheism, since it presents Yahweh as a personal creator, not a pervading force in the universe. After the fall from perfection in Eden, we became morally broken, in need of deliverance. The Sabbath is also an emblem of Yahweh's sanctifying power to recreate His righteous image in us. The first angel's message in Revelation chapter 14 is a universal proclamation of the everlasting gospel. coupled with Yahweh's symbol of his sanctifying power.
And I saw another angel fly in the midst of heaven, having the everlasting gospel to preach unto them that dwell on the earth, and to every nation and kindred and tongue and people, saying with a loud voice, Fear God, and give glory to him, for the hour of his judgment is come, and worship him that made heaven and earth and the sea and the fountains of waters.
That the reference in Revelation chapter 14 verse 7 is to the Sabbath is made clear by the fact that the words made heaven and earth and the sea were taken right from the Sabbath commandment in Exodus chapter 20 verse 11 and used here. This command rejects idolatry of all kinds, including self-worship. It totally repudiates evolution, which denies that God is creator and redeemer. Secular fundamentalists are no longer content to simply denounce Christianity, and atheistic dogmatism is attached to their crusade. Harris would like to encourage people to celebrate a weekly godless Sabbath to replace Yahweh's fourth commandment. His interview with Gary Wolfe speaks volumes about the diabolism behind the new atheism.
We discuss what it might look like, this world without God. There would be a religion of reason, Harris says. We would have realized the rational means to maximize human happiness. We may all agree that we want to have a Sabbath that we take really seriously, a lot more seriously than most religious people take it, but it would be a rational decision, and it would not be just because it's in the Bible. We would be able to invoke the power of poetry and ritual and silent contemplation and all the variables of happiness so that we could exploit them. Call it prayer, but we would have prayer without bull. At some point, there's going to be enough pressure that it's going to be too embarrassing to believe in God.
By replacing the fourth commandment with a godless Sabbath, Harris knows he is expressing the ultimate disrespect to the King of the universe. Today's skeptics have not learned the painful lesson from the reign of terror in the French Revolution, when men elevated the religion of reason to replace the word of God. History taught us that the demagogues of atheism always ends up overthrowing religion with violence.
Atheists often speak about the eradication of religion as if this would be a painless, even pleasant process. Perhaps they are not unlike naive carnivores who believe that animals conveniently lie down at an appropriate moment and die painlessly so that they may be eaten by appreciative humans. The naive atheist seems to believe that a sophisticated seminar in godlessness is all that is required to eliminate religion, showing a grateful people that they can be liberated from an oppressive and debilitating illusion. The reality of the situation is bloody, messy, and brutal. The eradication of faith tends to involve firing squads and gas chambers.
Each of the new atheists are contributing to the reconstruction of the philosophical framework of the French Revolution.